Ever since Mormonism entered the scene in 1830, people have been arguing the question of whether Joseph Smith received his doctrines by direct revelation from God or whether Joseph borrowed from others in his own time and place. Believers tend to adopt the restored by revelation idea. Non-believers tend to adopt the borrowed from others idea. That much is not surprising. What is surprising is that in the last several years, a number of Mormon apologists have come to adopt and even publicly espouse the idea that Joseph got his unique doctrines of Mormonism not from God, but from others in his milieu. One of those top apologists is Professor Terryl Givens. We'll tell you his story tonight and how it is that Joseph Smith really created Mormonism. That's the signpost up ahead. Your next stop, Mormonism Live. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Thank you for joining us tonight. Good evening, Mr. Real. How are you doing?
I'm so good, Mr. Radio Free Mormon. How are you?
I'm okay. I'm struggling with a small cold. It's affected my voice a bit. People have noticed, and so I brought in some throat lozenges tonight. Okay, so I apologize for doing this, especially on the air. But otherwise, I'm not going to get to the end. There's going to be a lot of talking being done tonight because this is a very important episode. In fact, I think this may be one of the most important episodes we've done here at Mormonism Live, dealing with doctrinal issues and especially foundational doctrinal issues like how it is that Joseph Smith created Mormonism. Not just the Book of Mormon, but the whole damn thing. What do you think, Mr. Real?
I just want to know if you're using natural lozenges like Bricolage or if you're going with, what brand are you using there, my friend?
I'm not sure. I just stick anything in my mouth.
I'll tell you this. I'll just jump into it. I'll tell you this.
It's Ricola.
Ricola, see? All natural.
You say Ricola?
Yeah, Ricola.
Okay.
They got the guys in the mountain that are blowing those like horns that go all the way to the ground.
Could you do that once more? No, I meant the part before that.
Yeah.
That was good.
I'll just say this. I think tonight's episode is monumental in that you have got so much of Terryl Givens' thoughts and comments, things he said, put into one place. And I think the argument is deeply convincing. By the time we get to the end, I think the audience will see it.
Well, thank you very much. We've got a number of slides to get through. So let's get started. First off, we have to establish who the heck Terryl Givens is and why it is we should pay any attention to anything that he says. There's the great thumbnail that you created, How Joseph Smith Created Mormonism, holding the cookbook, ominously subtitled, To Serve Man. And there's Terryl Givens right there. He's just a little imp coming out behind that distraught Mormon who's finding out what it is that Terryl Givens is actually saying and writing about.
Yep. And you can
I'm supposed to do this. I get it. So this is from his homepage. Terryl Givens. He's an author. He's a scholar. He's a disciple. Might give you an idea. Yeah. He's kind of a, I don't know, believing Mormon. I don't want to make any judgments. I think he is believing, certainly not in standard Mormonism, the way it's taught from the pulpit.
At the very least, he's a big deal.
Observant. That's the word. He's an observant member of the church. He's a professor of literature and religion. And he's the J. Bez E. Bostwick Professor of English at the University of Richmond. That sounds like a big deal. He's currently a Neal A. Maxwell Fellow. He's a senior fellow now at BYU. The New York Times has praised him for his provocative writing. Harper's has called him fair-minded, scholarly, and unbiased. And I think that's largely true. I think he's very unbiased. I want to applaud him for how unbiased he is, being that he is an observant Mormon and dealing with issues related to Mormonism. This was one of the books. Did you read this book? This was like his first book, his first major publication. Came out in 2003, which to my shock is now over 200 years ago. That's why I'm shocked. It's also over 20 years ago, 2003. Yeah. Yes. And that was a big deal. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I've got it on my shelf here. I was looking to see if I could take it off the shelf really quick, but I do have By the Hand of Mormon by Terryl Givens.
Great book, approaching the Book of Mormon from an academic point of view, but still believing. but still dealing with the evidence. It's kind of like you used to do in your Mormon discussions days, that podcast.
Yeah.
And the New York Times book review apparently called it provocative reading, whether you happen to be a Mormon or not. He also wrote The God Who Weeps. He wrote that with his wife, Fiona. I read that one. Did you read that one, Bill?
I read this one as well. I have this one on my shelf also.
Yeah, I think his books are putting weight on a lot of people's shelves.
Yeah.
Here's The Crucible of Doubt. I read that one. It came out in 2014.
Same.
I read this guy all over the place. I even did a podcast about him. It's number 116, which I think, if I'm doing my calculations right, is around 5 years ago. And what I did was, okay, here's how this whole thing happened, right? Terryl Givens does a 9-minute video. He's still a senior fellow for the Neal A. Maxwell Institute, which is the resurrected farms, right? After it got adopted by BYU and put under its umbrella some years ago. So that's what the Neal A. Maxwell Institute is, name years. He's a senior fellow. So he appears in videos put out by the Neal A. Maxwell Institute, which also means that it's under the aegis or with the imprimatur of the LDS Church, because it's part of it now, just as much as BYU is. All right. I did this like 5 years ago. I'm sorry. I'm trying to get to how I got here. Okay. How I got here is this. So Terryl Givens does, within this past week, like a 9-minute video, which we will get to, a 9-minute video for the Neal A. Maxwell Institute, where he's talking about Joseph Smith and he's talking about Joseph Smith's books. And the reason he knows what books Joseph Smith had, at least at some point in his life, is because there was going to be a library in Nauvoo. So this is obviously the 1840s. And Joseph Smith donated a number of books from his own personal library to the Nauvoo library, and somebody wrote it down, the titles of the books that he donated. So Terryl has this idea. He wants to get each and every copy. He's a collector. Who can explain collectors? I used to collect comic books, right? So he wants to collect them all. And these, of course, are old copies. And what he talks about is all the different things that Joseph Smith was reading about, as revealed by the books in his library. And he is completely knocking the pins out from under the revelatory foundation of the LDS Church while he does it. And we're going to get to that. Now, that was Martine, by the way, who sent that to me. I want to give her credit for that. Thank you for sending that my way. It made me think of this podcast that I did about 5 years ago about Terryl Givens, where I had reviewed the first chapter of his then most recently released book about the Pearl of Great Price, called The Pearl of Greatest Price. And I document how he systematically says that Joseph Smith got this idea from this source contemporary to him. And Joseph Smith got this idea probably from this source contemporary to him. He does this about 11 times in the one chapter. And then I add a couple more, one of my own, and one that I think is new this podcast. It's an idea I've had for a while, but finally we got the context to present it in, and that'll be number 14. I think it's exciting. I think it's wonderful. Then we're going to see this video, and all of a sudden, when you see this video, we'll play a few clips from it. You're going to see exactly what it is that Terryl Givens is saying, and he's giving away the game on how it is that Joseph Smith created Mormonism, to the point where if somebody wants to argue with me about Joseph Smith not adopting ideas from his own milieu, but instead this is revelation from God, or it's coming from the ancient Near East or something like that, I say, look, I hear what you're saying, but your argument isn't with me, it's with Terryl Givens. Okay. Any thoughts before we start there, Bill?
No. Well, let me say this. Mormon apologists forever have pushed back against the idea that Joseph Smith stole material from his surrounding, in spite of the fact that evidence over the last couple of decades have come forward from sermons in the Palmyra area, different books that we'll go into tonight that he had in his library. Randall Bell, we talked about the university that Hiram Smith went to. Yeah, Dartmouth. And so there's enough of those things, and I think this really started to kind of capsulate when Grant Palmer did his insider's view of Mormonism. And I think there were some things that Grant pointed to that were sort of undebatable at that point. Some things I think maybe are sort of weak, but there were several things in there quite strong. And the apologists have had to come around. Anybody with any sort of credibility, and I will say Terryl has some credibility because he does this, he is acknowledging what the critic has been telling the church forever, which is Joseph Smith didn't get the Book of Mormon or Mormonism from God. He got it from the content of his surroundings. And Terryl, while still trying to hang on to God as some sort of source in all of it, is acknowledging that the critic's right. So much of Mormonism comes from Joseph Smith's surroundings.
Yes. Yeah. My take on Terryl Givens is, first off, obviously he's no dummy. He's a smart guy. Okay.
Yep.
What I see him doing, I see his whole mission, though he would never put it this way, is making Mormonism respectable to the Mormon intelligentsia. I think that's what he's trying to do. And maybe he's succeeding. He's convinced himself. So, and he's intelligent. So let's see what you think of what he has to say. Oh, this is one, Pearl of Greatest Price, 2019, chapter 1 of this book, having to do with the Book of Moses. And as you have said, and as we've talked about before, the Book of Moses is in the Pearl of Great Price. It is also the first several chapters of the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible, beginning with Genesis. And chapter 1 is a complete edition. It's a prologue to the book of Genesis. And it's there to describe how it is that Joseph Smith, not that Joseph Smith, but that Moses knows how the earth and the cosmos was created. This is a huge chestnut. It always has been. How does Moses know the stuff that happened before him, especially way back when the whole earth was created? And the Book of Moses, chapter 1, answers that question by saying that it was revealed to him in a vision from God. That's how he knows. Okay? There's a few other things that happen, but I think that's the main point of it. So chapter 1, the Book of Moses, Terryl Givens gives a deep reading of the Book of Moses and points out numerous places where Joseph Smith may have gotten his doctrine and teachings from other sources. He gives 11 instances of such borrowing. Stealing is such a harsh word. Now, here's example number 1. I want you to know that these quoted sections are quotes from Terryl Givens' book from chapter 1, but I have to give it this caveat that I have somehow misplaced in my moves that book. So I have spent, it was yesterday, a very long period of yesterday, hours of yesterday, sitting down and listening to myself read these from the book in that podcast. I think it was 116 for 5 years ago, and laboriously typing this out and then having to go back and do that whole 9 yards. So there could be a couple of small mistakes in this. And if there are, that's what it's accounted to. There's nothing of any substance that's wrong in any of this, except for one thing, which I just remembered, which I'll correct when we get to it. Oh, could you read this one, Bill?
I'd love to. So example number 1, the Adam Clarke Bible Commentary. Quote, clearly he considered that his work was, in this regard, scriptural production, not merely emendation.
Can I stop you right there?
Yeah.
Here's the thing. Terryl writes very densely with a lot of scholarly language. It takes me having to slow down and really think about what it is he's saying to understand what he's saying. What he's saying here is what we all know, but what most apologists fight against. What he's saying is that the Joseph Smith translation, that's his work, Joseph Smith considered it to be a scriptural production, not merely emending or modifying. Okay? He's producing scripture. That's how Joseph Smith considered it. He's not giving an inspired commentary. I'm sorry. Go ahead, please.
Yeah. Clearly, he considered that his work was, in this regard, scriptural production, not merely emendation. At the same time, he would manifest in his decision to study Hebrew, even as he applied his prophetic gifts to grappling with Egyptian papyri. He felt that the tools of the scholar and the seer were complementary. And so, as scholars have noted, he was not adverse to employing learned commentaries, even as he invoked prophets' authority and prerogative to edit Holy Writ.
Now, he says all of that to try and prepare you so you don't, your knees don't buckle and you fall on the floor in a dead faint. He has to prepare you that prophets, it's okay. Don't worry about what I'm going to tell you, because prophets and Joseph Smith were fine using Bible commentaries in producing their scripture. This is what he's trying to prepare you for, because we know what's coming next. Go ahead and read what's coming next.
Thomas Wayment and Haley Lemon have found in Joseph's translation 200 to 300 examples of clear influence from Adam Clarke's commentary, and these reflect how Smith used academic sources while simultaneously melding his own prophetic inspiration into the resulting text.
Okay, so this is example number 1 of the 11, and it's the Adam Clarke Bible commentary. At the time that he wrote this, I believe that the paper itself had not been produced, but that synopsis under the Orca website had been. So, but he's telling everybody, look, there's all these connections. He's going to be honest, and I appreciate that about Professor Givens. He's going to mention it. He's not going to omit it and hope you don't find out, because it makes the Joseph Smith translation and Joseph Smith scripture production process look suspect.
Yeah.
He's going to try and spin it, but he's going to at least deal with it. So I appreciate that. The way he spins it and the way he will spin everything is he will say, yes, Joseph Smith borrowed everything, including the kitchen sink, from people in his own milieu to construct Mormonism. But he was inspired in the things he borrowed from everybody, and he borrowed only those things that God wanted him to borrow to create the one true church.
Yeah, and the only problem with that is that Thomas Wayment has gone on the public record and noted that Joseph Smith's Bible translation doesn't appear to look anything. The corrections that Smith made do not have the resemblance of what we would expect from the Bible actually being corrected, amended, restored in any way. It is common errors transferred over, and it is the ideas of Adam Clarke and other sort of 19th century ideas that make their way into the Joseph Smith translation, to the point where Thomas Wayment is the first person on the inside of the church to say, it's actually not really a translation. It's a commentary, and it's a flawed commentary at that.
Right. And I just want to jump in here and give you credit for having Haley Lemon on your show. And you broke that story with her interview way back when. And once again, also give her credit because she's the one who discovered it. She just happened to be the graduate student, and Thomas Wayment, her professor. But, it's not like he didn't do anything. And credit to him, because as a BYU professor, you got a graduate student who comes to you with this, you got a decision to make. And I think Professor Wayment made the right decision. But of course, he got transferred out of the scripture department to something like classics in order to, I guess, make him less dangerous to students.
Mormonism does that thing, doesn't it? Where it tries to hide the truth, and then it eventually tries to hide you if you're telling the truth. So you did that in the Rules of the Game episode, but this was episode 299, folks. If you're looking for it, you can find it on YouTube. You can find it on MormonDiscussionsPodcasts.org. It's episode 299
of Mormon Discussions.
Yeah, on the Joseph Smith translation, revelation or plagiarism. And I did share
I've said it before. I'm going to say it again. Haley Lemon trusted you because she did the interview with you before she graduated.
Yeah.
And you had an agreement that she insisted upon that you not release that interview until after she had graduated and had her diploma in her hand. And the reason why is because she was worried that she would get in trouble with BYU for being on your show and maybe not get her diploma. This is the kind of thing that BYU students actually have to deal with. And of course, you were true to the agreement, and she got her diploma, gave you the high sign, and you went and premiered that episode.
This was the main impetus for her losing her testimony and stepping away from the church. She had to come to grips that the way in which she was taught that the Joseph Smith translation was a certain thing, her research along with Thomas Wayman demonstrated that such was not the case, and that the most logical explanation was that the Joseph Smith translation was in fact a creation out of Joseph Smith plagiarizing from his milieu.
Yep. I mean, think about it for just a second, okay? Joseph Smith is doing a Joseph Smith translation of the Bible. He is aware of, as pretty much everybody was, the Adam Clark Bible commentary. It was the preeminent Bible commentary, in which at several places, what he's doing is he is correcting the King James Version, giving interpretations, showing what other earlier manuscripts perhaps have to say, or other traditions. So what this commentary is doing in many instances is purporting to give an earlier and purer and better version of the Bible than we have in the 1820s. Okay? That's why Joseph Smith would have been attracted to it as something he can look at to help him in his avowed goal to restore the things that were lost from the Bible and make those things which once were clear, plain and clear, right? Make them plain and clear again. Okay. I'm not sure if that's ever actually been said. Maybe it doesn't need to be said, but sometimes things that don't need to be said, when they're said, people get it. Okay. Example number 2, errors in the Book of Moses. This is interesting because what this does is it's not actually showing another source. I apologize for that. But what it's doing is it's showing what it is that apologists and intellectuals always seem to end up doing, okay? He is going to undermine faith in the Book of Mormon by letting everybody know that there's errors in our current Book of Moses that haven't been taken care of. And I didn't see where he said what they were. Could you read this, Bill?
Yes. Example number 2, errors in the Book of Moses. Quote, when Franklin D. Richards' committee created the 1878 version of the Book of Moses, they placed more confidence in the work of the RLDS Church than Brigham Young apparently did. For Orson Pratt, in effect, copied material from the RLDS Church's published text into the Pearl of Great Price. Along the way, he corrected some of the RLDS Church's errors, but also inadvertently imported many others which have been retained in the modern editions of the Book of Moses.
Isn't that a funny thing to say? Oh, wait a second here. Sorry. Yeah, isn't that a funny thing to say? There's errors in the Book of Moses, but I'm not going to tell you what they are. And once again, I don't have the book, but if there had been a footnote that listed what they were, I would have found it. I know where to look for a footnote. It's usually at the end of a sentence.
Yeah. And I only want to note here really quickly, research has been done. Book of Moses borrows thematic and verse material from both Book of Matthew and Book of Luke, Sermon on the Mount, Sermon on the Plains. Book of Moses, while in Mormon theology would need to be completely unrelated to the Book of Luke and the Book of Matthew, has overlapping thematic material that would make it seem oddly strange and appear most reasonably to be explained as, again, direct borrowing of Joseph Smith from the New Testament in order to create the Book of Moses.
Yes. Thank you for adding that. Example number 3, filling in holes in the biblical narrative. All right. First thing is that Terryl Givens recognizes that this has been going on for thousands of years. It's an age-old and respected tradition, is that if you've got a hole in a text, for instance, 2,000 years ago, we don't know a lot about Jesus's childhood. 2 Gospels tell us about how he was born in completely different ways. And we find out about his, I think, circumcision. Not his circumcision, but his trip to Jerusalem where he gets lost. And that's about it. So that's a hole. That's a huge hole. And what pious people did who were literate, they filled the hole with invented stories about Jesus and his adventures and misadventures as a young boy with godlike powers, trying to learn how to use them and causing his dad and the neighbors all kinds of concern and grief along the way. One of those is the infancy gospel of James. The other is the proto-evangelium of John. I might have gotten those. The infancy gospel of Thomas, and the proto-evangelium of James. I think I got it right that time. So these are collections of stories about what happened with Jesus that fill in all these great gaps, right? So he notes that, and if he doesn't note it, he references it. And I want to make sure you understand that, because what he's going to say is one of these holes happens in Numbers chapter 12. I have spent my career of 35 years as an attorney reading police reports. I've written thousands and thousands of pages and other discovery, right? One of the things that's very common that happens is, let's say I got a police report from some kind of crime, and police go out, and the police are there, and this one police report says, yeah, I was there, and Officer Larson was there, and Officer Hansen was there, okay? And you've got the police report of the first officer because you're reading from it. You got the report from Larson, but you don't have any report from Hansen. And you go, something's missing. So you got to request Hansen's report, because sometimes stuff gets lost. It doesn't have to be sinister. There are times when what you have tells you that you don't have something, and that's an illustration. Same thing with Numbers chapter 12, except it's not a police report. There's a conversation that's going on with Moses and God, in which references something that's not in the text, which is a visionary experience that Moses had with God, where he talked to God face to face. All right? That's another hole in the narrative. And what Professor Givens is going to suggest and argue is that Joseph Smith used that hole to fill it with a face-to-face vision that Moses had with God, which is itself Moses chapter 1. Did you understand that? Did you get that one? Did I describe it okay?
Yeah, I understand. And it's, again, we talked about this, and I don't know how to connect the dots here, but we already spoke about the Bible translation is a flawed commentary, according to Thomas Wayment. Terryl Givens agrees with Wayment's research that Smith borrowed 200 to 300 times from Adam Clarke's commentary. That's a problem for the Book of Moses. Anything suggested in the Book of Moses to be the actual filling in of holes with actual historical material that isn't present in the text is made problematic by Joseph Smith plagiarizing from scholars in his contemporary milieu without ever mentioning them at all, and articulating to the saints, the other leaders around him, and those leaders articulating to the saints going forward that what Joseph Smith was doing was restoring a corrupt version of the Bible to its original form.
Yes. You know, it's similar to what Joseph Smith did with the Joseph Smith translation, where the majority, I believe it is, confirm if I'm correct, the majority of changes that he made were places where there were italics in the text. Because Joseph Smith understood that italics were English words that were added to the Hebrew in order to translate it understandably into English. You had to add a few words in English for it to make sense in English. So he understood that, apparently, and that's where he chose to make his changes, where there was actually a gap there, and he knew there was a gap, and the gap was the italicized words that weren't reflected in Hebrew.
Yeah, and the only thing I'll add there, and I don't need to keep adding things, but also there are instances in his work where he carried over errors that were also italicized, that were errors added in during the translation process in the Bible version he was using, which made its way into the Book of Mormon, for instance, as one example, when sort of chapters of Isaiah are used, which don't seem to get corrected by God, which indicates that rather than God telling Joseph Smith the translation, what was instead happening was Joseph was simply copying over from the Bible into the Book of Mormon and carried errors over to it.
Right. I think that that's important to recognize and not overlook the fact that the Bible was the primary source that Joseph Smith drew on in creating the Book of Mormon.
Yeah.
These are other ideas that go into Mormonism as well as into the Book of Mormon, but ideas in his milieu, ideas from other people. And here's the Bible as well, but it's not what the Bible's saying so much as what it's the Bible not saying, or the Bible creating a gap. Can you read this account for Numbers chapter 12, verses 5 through 8?
Yep.
Pay attention. You'll see it's referring to something else, even though it's King James English.
And the Lord came down in the pillar of the cloud and stood in the door of the tabernacle and called Aaron and Miriam, and they both came forth. And he said, Hear now my words. If there be a prophet among you, I, the Lord, will make myself known unto him in a vision, and will speak unto him in a dream. My servant Moses is not so, who is faithful in all mine house. With him will I speak mouth to mouth, even apparently, and not in dark speeches. In the similitude of the Lord shall he behold. Wherefore, then were ye not afraid to speak against my servant Moses.
Okay, so to the extent I was describing this as something that had happened in the past, it looks like something referred to in the future, though. In other words, why would you have verse 8 in there describing that Moses is going to have a mouth-to-mouth convo with God, and he will have this, and then it's missing from the book of Numbers? It's a strange thing. And what Terryl Givens is suggesting is this creates a hole, just like the infancy narratives, and Joseph Smith used this as a prompt to create Moses chapter 1, which is framed as a face-to-face visitation with God. He writes, a passage from the Old Testament suggests that episodes not only from Christ's life, that's the infancy narratives, but from the Mosaic narrative, that's Numbers chapter 12, are missing from the text we now have, where Moses in the 12th chapter of Numbers alludes to and then neglects to reveal a particular visionary encounter with God. Smith may have found all the prompt he needed. Listen to this. Joseph Smith may have found all the prompt he needed to go beyond mere textual edits to a quest for a more ample vision to fill in the missing chapters in the story. That is a lot of highbrow language that boils down to what I just told you, that Joseph Smith may have used this gap, recognized it as a gap, and then created a story to fill it.
Yeah. Givens' language seems to indicate that this is all stuff going on in Joseph Smith's head alone. And he doesn't posit any sort of revelatory process happening to create it. I want to note that. And then I want to show one other thing here, a comment on the screen. Cray, and maybe Cray's joking, I don't know if he's serious, but he says, I find it miraculous that a barely literate farm boy did all this. And I just want to say to the same thing you said earlier, we're not saying Joseph Smith wasn't barely literate. Terryl Givens isn't saying Joseph Smith was barely literate. By the time the show's over, you'll at least see one instance where Givens makes the argument that Joseph was a hell of a lot more literate than even his mother gave him credit for.
I think Cray is probably being facetious. There's that Poe's law thing that comes into play where you can't tell the difference between satire and a sincerely held religious belief.
Yeah.
But on the off chance that that Cray, I thought you were. But if you were being serious, Cray, and if you weren't being Cray, you were just being Cray, then I would have to say, hey, I hear what you're saying, but your argument's not with me. It's with Terryl Givens.
Right.
Okay. Oh, did I read the bottom thing? Yeah, I think I did. He goes on, in that chapter of the Bible, Numbers 12, the Lord promises that he will speak face to face with his prophet, not in dark speeches, but openly, so that Moses will actually see the similitude of the Lord. The Bible, however, contains no account of this promised visitation. Whether such a lacuna, which means a nice body of blue water at an island. No, wait, that's a laguna. This is a lacuna. That's a gap in a text, okay? Whether such a lacuna or whether such a missing story, I have to make fun of him. He's hopelessly pompous, you know this. Whether such a lacuna or whether such a missing story was the catalyst for Joseph Smith, we do not know. But the first tangible fruit of Joseph Smith's work, this is where he says, we don't know if this really was the prompt, Numbers 12, for Joseph Smith to create Moses 1. This is where he says, we don't know, but look at this evidence I've got. But the first tangible fruit of Joseph Smith's work on the new translation of the Bible, the first tangible fruit was a detailed account. In other words, it's Moses chapter 1, was a detailed account that describes the unrecorded fulfillment of that promise.
I want to add, I know this show's going to go 6 hours. I'm really sorry, RFM. You're pointing out something about Givens. Givens is, you've said it a couple times, he's always using big words. It's almost like he wants to force you to stop your reading 13 times in every paragraph to grab a dictionary and to look words up. When I worked for Young's Floor Covering back in Ohio years and years ago, over a decade ago, there was a trade magazine for window treatments. And there was a quote in the trade magazine that said, when followers fail to incorporate fundamental precepts into built form, they're likely to perpetuate previous manifestations. Now, tons of big words. So I've remembered it because it's this intentional sentence that's absurd. And all it means is that if you don't pay attention to the mistakes of your predecessors, you're bound to repeat them. And I just want to say this to Terryl Givens. In the future, Terryl, if you really want people to just have a little bit more ease of reading your stuff, you don't have to rub it in their face that you're a smart guy. We all know it already. You've read a few good books. You've gone to a good school. Use the language that the rest of us understand. One of the things I always get credit for, RFM, is I say things in a way that the layman can understand what I'm saying. And Terryl Givens, you don't do that, and you make it difficult. And we'll all figure it out. It's just 6 more hours of our day wasted reading Webster's dictionary.
Now, the thing is this, it's not just that he uses big words, okay? The fact is that he uses them patronizingly. And the way you can tell he uses them patronizingly is because he'll use his big word, and then he'll say another expression, which is the equivalent of the big word, but it will be in simple language so that you dummies out there can understand what he's talking about. This is a classic instance where he writes, whether such a lacuna or whether such a missing story was the catalyst for Joseph Smith, we do not know. Okay? He'll do that elsewhere. He's like teaching us what the big word means as he writes. He writes, evidence that Joseph Smith was in fact restoring that missing narrative, Moses 1, was confirmed to him in the same revelation. And what happened was I went to Moses 1 to see if I could see what it was he was talking about. And I found 2 instances. Because the thing is this, okay? And I think this is smart of him. I think it's brilliant of him. Moses chapter 1 fits the bill for filling the hole created by Numbers chapter 12, right? But it's not just that. Moses chapter 1 itself self-referentially talks about the fact that this story will become lost. Here, let me show you what I mean. Can you read those? Moses chapter 1, 23, and then 41?
And now of this thing, his encounter with Satan and God, Moses bore record. But because of wickedness, it is not had among the children of men.
Whoa, 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 whoa. The book of Moses knows that chapter 1 will be lost and will have to be restored. That's where you're tipping your hand a bit as the author. And it does the same thing in verse 41 of chapter 1.
Yeah, there's a thing that isn't going to exist. And here I am on the back end to put it back together for you.
Yes. Can you read 41?
And in a day when the children of men shall esteem my words as naught, and take many of them from the book which thou shalt write, behold, I will raise up another like unto thee, and they shall be had again among the children of men, among as many as shall believe. And again, so he does it a second time.
Why is it that this vision that's being received and restored through Joseph Smith, as Terryl Givens argues, to plug a hole in the narrative in Numbers 12 that refers to a vision that isn't there anymore? Why is it that Moses chapter 1 knows it will be lost?
I'll just add here, this also is an indicator that Joseph really did want the crowd, the reader, to believe that what he was doing was to restore a corrupt version of the Bible to its original form. It can't just be a flawed commentary, folks. It has to be a translation, or else this all falls apart.
Right. Now, a flawed commentary, that's actually what it is.
Yeah.
But where's the inspiration? Well, that's taken more and more faith to find. Okay. Here's 2 phrases that Terryl Givens uses throughout his book about Joseph Smith, and I think they're very interesting. Revelatory imagination and prophetic imagination, which he will apply to Joseph Smith's production of Scripture. And we'll see at least one of those in one of the quotes I have. But both of them have one word in common. Do you know what word that is, Bill?
Imagination.
Imagination. Example number 4, other inhabited worlds. Terryl Givens writes, this stupefying vision, because remember in chapter 1 of Moses, it talks about other planets and other worlds, and we find out that they're inhabited, but only a vision of the creation of this earth will I give unto you, Moses, my son. So this stupefying vision, Terryl writes, overwhelms Moses with his own finitude and smallness. There's another example. Those two words mean exactly the same. Smallness does not add to the meaning of the sentence and therefore is redundant. It is included only because he knows that there are people out there who aren't going to understand finitude, and so he wants to make it accessible to the Hicks, okay? With his own finitude and smallness. That God's creations include other inhabited worlds had been hinted or brazenly posited many times in the past. What? Terryl, you're not acting like the apologists of yore. You are no Daniel C. Peterson. I worked with Daniel C. Peterson. I knew Daniel C. Peterson. You, Terryl Givens, are no Daniel C. Peterson, because Daniel C. Peterson would have hid this stuff. But Terryl Givens is not hiding it, and he's letting us know that this idea of other inhabited worlds had been hinted or even posited brazenly, openly, publicly, famously, many times in the past. And that's Joseph Smith's past, by the way. Now, this is a hint. This is a hint. When John Milton's Adam asks the angel Raphael, his Paradise Lost, about the seeming waste of so many underutilized heavenly spheres, common question, right? Why you got so many stars up there? They don't really help a lot. They look pretty on a night, but they don't help the crops grow. Why do you have all these worlds up there if they're uninhabited? He's told that they are ordained for uses unto his Lord best known. So you don't need to know. It's on a need to know basis, Adam, and you don't need to know. But in Joseph Smith's own day, there's a play called Cain, which was written by Lord Byron, which I never knew until I read this book. But Raphael's counterpart was more forthcoming. And in that play, Lucifer, so that's Raphael's counterpart, okay? All he's saying is that in Joseph Smith's day, there was a play called Cain. And in it, Lucifer tells Cain, Adam's son, of worlds greater than thine own, inhabited by greater things, and they themselves far more in number than the dust of thy dull earth. Okay? So the first one from Paradise Lost, John Milton, is going to be a hint. This one from the play Cain, that's brazenly stated. And it sounds a lot like the way it's put in Moses. Can you read that, Bill?
Moses 1:27, and it came to pass, as the voice was still speaking, Moses cast his eyes and beheld the earth, yea, even all of it. And there was not a particle of it which he did not behold, discerning it by the Spirit of God. And he beheld also the inhabitants thereof. And there was not a soul which he had beheld not. And he discerned them by the Spirit of God, and their numbers were great, even numberless as the sands upon the seashore. I just want to note here, RFM, and we'll see it in the video at the end. Givens goes so far as to say, not only do we know the books, and do we know that Joseph Smith borrowed from the books, and this is how he created Mormon theology, but we also can guess which books that we don't know he had, but that we think he had, because the correlation is so strong. And Paradise Lost is one of the books that he mentions.
Yes, John Milton.
It is such a thing. We live in 2024, and what apologists are now doing are going, critics right. Not only did he copy from the things we know he had that we've been sort of ignoring and pretending didn't exist, but we actually now know books that we don't know he had, but we're pretty sure he did because he copied from those too.
Well, Terryl Givens seems certain of it.
Yeah.
And you'll see him do that. In fact, when we get to this video, okay, from this past week, he will be speaking about a book that Joseph Smith had in his library, which was a collection of different essays or pieces written by different authors. I think it was different authors, but they were different subjects. And one of the subjects was about John Milton. And Terryl Givens believes and says that, well, first off, he says he has a colleague who's doing research on the influence of John Milton's writings on Mormonism and Joseph Smith. And then he says that This one paper in this one book that was in Joseph Smith's collection is probably how Joseph Smith got introduced to John Milton. Makes sense to me. See, you don't have to know all these books and read them from cover to cover. You can actually read other people's writings about them. It's like the 1800s Cliff Notes version. Okay, Thomas Dick. Once again, this is Terryl Givens writing. Thomas Dick, whom Joseph Smith read. I highlighted that. You know why I highlighted that, Bill? Because he doesn't put any kind of seems or apparently or could have or may have or probably. Nope, he knows he read them. And there's reason. It's provable. It's demonstrable. Thomas Dick, whom Joseph Smith read, contemplated a history of numerous worlds dispersed throughout the universe, replenished with inhabitants, with their own modes of existence, of improvement, and of social intercourse, including solemn forms of worship and adoration. And this is Reverend Thomas Dick, who lived from 1774 to 1857, so born substantially before Joseph Smith, lived till after Joseph Smith. He's a British church minister, science teacher, and writer, known for his works on astronomy and practical philosophy, combining science and Christianity and arguing for a harmony between the two. Could you read this part? This isn't in the book written by Terryl Givens. This is just something I found on the internet when I was researching Thomas Dick, because Terryl Givens is talking about the fact that Thomas Dick did believe in other inhabited worlds. He doesn't go into the details. Here's some of the details.
In 1837, the Scottish scientist Thomas Dick had a big idea, a really, really big idea. Build a huge triangle or ellipses of many miles in extent in Siberia or any other country. He figured that because there are some 22 trillion aliens living in our solar system, 4.2 billion of which are on the moon. Even if they don't have telescope technology to spy the triangle, surely some would have eyes powerful enough to see it unaided. There's a concept I've heard before.
Which part?
People living on the moon.
Oh, right. Exactly. See, his idea was simply that we've got these different planets, and we don't know about all the planets that we do now. I don't think they did then. Of course, Pluto's been in and out as a planet, so that complicates things. But regardless, whatever planets they knew about, including the sun, including the moon, what he postulated was that they were populated, and they were probably populated to a degree roughly the same as the Earth was populated. That's my understanding of his theory. So putting that out there, you got 22 trillion aliens, and I think that's probably going to be sucked up a lot by the sun. But with only 4.2 billion on the moon, only 4. I got a feeling they thought the moon was a lot bigger back then. Anyway, that's what he thought. And so this is in the environment that Joseph Smith's in. And lo and behold, wow, we got other inhabited worlds in his revelations. And this is what Terryl Givens is pointing out and suggesting strongly that this is where Joseph Smith got the idea from. Example number 5, 2 creation accounts in Genesis 1 and 2. The current scholarly opinion on these 2 accounts is that one is much earlier and one is much later. And that the one that is much earlier has God being much more anthropomorphic. He walks in the garden in the cool of the day. He creates Adam's body out of mud using his own hands, gets his hands dirty. He's a gardener. And that's the earlier one, much earlier one. And the one that's much later is where God is no longer anthropomorphized, but his creation is not physical. It is speaking things into existence. And that later one in time, that later creation account got put as Genesis 1. And Genesis 2 is actually the earlier one, I believe. It cuts off a little bit off the chapter, I'm aware. But that's basically what it is. Okay, so that's what scholars understand now. Now, what Joseph Smith understood was that an earlier creation account was spiritual. And the second account was physical. And this is how Terryl Givens puts it. Can you read this, Bill?
Smith recast the first and second creation accounts of Genesis 1 and 2, not as slightly different versions, but as the actual creation of the physical world in its and its inhabitants, in distinction from a record of an earlier creation, which was a kind of spiritual prototype. All those plants and animals and humans as well, Moses learns, were created spiritually before they were naturally upon the face of the earth. Before the documentary Hypothesis explained that Genesis 1 and 2 as simply unsynthesized narratives from two divergent ancient sources, some commentators explained chapter 2 as referring to an ideational creation, a kind of divinely imagined blueprint existing only in the mind of God. In other words, Joseph Smith perpetuates an old idea that is made obsolete by modern scholarship, which is that we have two creation accounts that ran parallel or at different times, but were separate from each other. And the way old Bible scholars, decades and, not even that, hundreds of years ago, the way they would speculate was that this was a ideological, and I want to use the word,
Ideational.
concept and a physical creation. And so Joseph Smith is running with the old idea because he doesn't have the modern scholarship to utilize.
Right. And that's a great point. To be clear, if modern scholars are right about this, and it really looks like they are, Joseph Smith would have been a prophet by identifying these as two different accounts, one earlier and one later. Wow, that would have been something. Unfortunately, it's not the case. It's never the case. So what ended up happening is Joseph Smith says there's a spiritual creation and then a physical creation. That accounts for the two creations. And what Terryl Givens is doing, as he's doing in each of these instances, is he's saying, yeah, Joseph Smith wasn't the only person who was interpreting it that way in his community. All right. And he says that other people were saying that this first creation in chapter 2, or the earlier one, was a kind of divinely imagined blueprint existing only in the mind of God, which is more like a spiritual creation, but not exactly. But it's certainly closer to what Joseph Smith taught than what the scholars teach about it today. He goes on. Can you read this part, Bill?
Yeah, and I'll just say, somebody says here, lies and deceits from the get-go. Yes, lies and deceits, and Givens shows the receipts. All right,
very good.
Jewish tradition, so this is back to the quote. Jewish traditions abound of a spiritual creation that preceded the physical. Paul Davies insisted that the Hebrew emphasis on the unity of body and spirit precluded an independent or prior existence for that spirit. Apparent references to such as in Psalm 139 and Jeremiah, he relegated to ideal existence in the mind and purpose of God. However, the 17th century Jewish scholar Manasseh ben Israel, that would be Manasseh, son of Israel, cites chapter 3 of the Bereshith Rabbah as teaching that human souls existed before embodiment, not just as ideas in the mind of God, right? So most of Christianity has a sort of in the mind of God, whereas Mormonism proclaims a premortal existence. All right, so
I think that in Jewish thought, or at least some strands of Jewish thought, that place is called the GUP, the G-U-P. It's the place where all the spirits exist who will ultimately be born to this planet. And the end of the earth occurs when the last spirit leaves the GUP, because it's a finite number. It's big, but finite.
Yeah. So back to it. Teaching that human souls existed before embodiment, not just as ideas in the mind of God, but as entities with whom he actually consulted before creation in order to make sure he did not clothe them with matter against their will.
Okay. So in other words, there's this huge tradition in Judaism that existed before Joseph Smith, and he's giving a cite. That's why he's citing to the 17th century. You do understand that, right? That's why he's citing to the 17th century, which means the 1600s, because it's before Joseph Smith. So it would have been available to him. That's the whole thing he's doing. And he's an apologist. Imagine what the critics of the church have to say. And here's example number 6, the Apocryphal New Testament, which is the name of a book published in 1820 in London. Bill, if you would be so kind, can you read this? I apologize. Once again, this is Terryl Givens writing.
Example number 6, the Apocryphal New Testament. In 1817, the English satirist William Hone suffered 3 high-profile trials for his impious attacks on Christianity. His greatest offense, however, was in his simple publication of a collection of ancient documents titled The Apocryphal New Testament. The threat this publication posed to the orthodoxy of the day was evident in its full title, which constituted a disconcerting assault on popular notions of biblical canonicity, being all the Gospels, epistles, and other pieces now extant attributed in the first 4 centuries to Jesus Christ, his apostles, and their companions, and not included in the New Testament by its compilers.
So there's the cover page of this book that caused such a sensation over in jolly old England, the Apocryphal New Testament, because these are actually ancient documents. All right. They don't go all the way back to necessarily the 1st century, but they're around and they're attributed to different people. I've read them all, and a lot of you have read them, and you probably heard of a lot of them. Here's what Terryl Givens says about it. Bill, could you please? I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I'll just start reading them automatically if you're okay with that. Here, readers could find the Gospel of the birth of Mary and Jesus's infancy narratives, along with the Gospel of Nicodemus and a general epistle of Barnabas. Diluting the singularity of the virtual inevitability of Christianity's key text was dangerous enough, but his real provocation was in the particular way he formatted the book, in double columns with verse numbers, just like the King James Version. The visual impact of the book was to blur crucial lines of demarcation and usurp the emblems of scriptural utterance. In other words, Hone's work was viewed as an assault on what Thomas Rennell called the radical and unassailable ground of distinction between scripture and non-scripture. No middle ground was possible in that view.
And what does the Book of Mormon do, Bill?
It does it in that same fashion.
Yes. It assaults the primacy and exclusivity of the Bible as being the only scriptural text. So the idea that the Bible did not contain, this is me, not Terryl. So the idea that the Bible did not contain all scripture was an idea prevalent in Joseph Smith's day. This book was published in London in 1820. The Book of Mormon, it's not the first one. I mean, it's not like that was the first time anybody knew that there were other books that were not contained in the Bible that existed. Book of Mormon, not with verses and double columns when it was published, right? It was published like a novel, but it was bound in such a way as the Bibles of Joseph Smith's day were bound. So they looked the same sitting on the shelf, side by side. However, today, both the Bible and the Book of Mormon look exactly the same in the manner of their publication too, with chapters and verses. Example number 7, the prophecy of Enoch. Now, Enoch, of course, occurs in the book of Moses. And there's a huge prophecy that he gives of the future. And what this has to do with is a lot about establishing Zion, because city of Enoch, right? This prophecy of Enoch sowed the seeds of the Latter-day Saints' most distinctive and vibrant doctrines in the following ways. It produced the most emphatic version of a passible deity the Christian world then knew. Let me stop. Passible. What passible means is that God is just okay. Jesus is just all right with me. Yeah, he's passible. That's not what passible means. What passible means is that he has passion. That's exactly what it means and all that it means. That's where our word passion comes from, or at least they're related words. So like the passion of Christ. It's the idea that God has emotion. So lots of creeds have God without body parts or passions, right? So that's an impassible God. He has no passion. The Mormon God, however, does have passion. And one of Terryl Givens' favorite themes is to go back to God weeping in the Enoch writings in the book of Moses. Okay? That's what he's talking about. So he's saying it produced the most emphatic version of a passible deity the Christian world then knew. It catalyzed, there's that word again. There you go. It catalyzed the LDS understanding of and enthusiasm for the doctrine of pre-mortal existence. It foreshadowed and still might more vitally inform, mark those words, Elder Rigdon, the church's distinctive doctrine of theosis or divination. Now, what I want to say about this is that he's talking about the prophecy of Enoch. I just want to make a comment. When he says, and still might more vitally inform, what Terryl Givens is signaling is that he understands this story in a way that adds dimension and meaning and depth and truth to the LDS doctrine of people becoming like God. But it's not being talked about by anybody else. So he's just going to hold it himself to his vest. He's not going to share with us what it is, but he wants to make darn sure that we know that he knows whatever it is that he knows. Do you have a comment about that, Bill?
Nope.
So I think I said this already, what's on the slide. It sounds like Givens knows more than the leaders of the church. That's what he's signaling. This is common among neo-apologists who tend to recreate Mormonism in their own intellectual image. I think this is what Givens does, and I think this is an example of him doing it. Example number 8, apostasy and restoration. Even those ideas, Terryl Givens is going to say Joseph Smith got from his community. Could you read this, Bill?
Yeah, and in fact, if you don't mind, I'm going to put something up on the screen here really quick.
Sure.
To your point you just made, the idea that the apologist, they won't say it out loud exactly, but they're indicating, yeah, we've done some research and we know more than the leaders do. Here's Patrick Mason. One of the problems we have in Mormonism is that we've loaded too much into the truth cart. And then when anything in the cart starts to rot a bit or look unseemly upon further inspection, some have a tendency to overturn the entire cart or seek a refund for the whole lot. We have loaded so much into the truth cart. Now, who loaded it in? It was Joseph Smith and Brigham Young and John Taylor and Wilford Woodruff and Heber J. Grant and Harold B. Lee and Joseph Fielding Smith and Bruce R. McConkie. It was the prophets, seers, and revelators.
And by the way, his ideas about what you can do with it are extremely myopic, because what he's saying is that this truth cart, when anything in the cart starts to rot a bit or look unseemly upon further inspection, some have a tendency to overturn the entire cart or seek a refund for the whole lot. No, I'll tell you what the TBMs do. They don't overturn it and they don't return it for a refund. They eat it. They eat it all because they're being told by their leaders to eat all of it.
Clark Gilbert,
they're so spiritually sick, I believe.
Yeah, Clark Gilbert at BYU's making the professors eat it, right? I'll just note, by the way, whatever is left in the truth cart is indiscernible from a fraud.
Yes.
That's what's left.
And it looks a lot like everyday Christianity.
Yeah. Okay. Back to this. Example number 8, apostasy and restoration. Givens reviews Smith's idea of restoration, and specifically his reliance on Revelation 12, where the woman flees into the wilderness. This is such a big idea of Givens. Where the woman flees into the wilderness where she is nourished for a time. Joseph Smith identified this woman as the church of God, that the woman represented God's church was a common interpretation in Smith's time. And Terryl Givens writes.
Okay, let me be clear here. There's this weird symbolic story in Revelation. It's got a few. And in chapter 12, they got this woman with her child fleeing into the wilderness, trying to escape the dragon. And she goes into the wilderness. And that's kind of what the story is, right? It is Joseph Smith who identified this woman as the church and used this as a metaphor for the apostasy. What Terryl Givens is going to say is he wasn't the first. Other people were already saying that. And that Joseph Smith probably got it from those people, not by revelation from God. So there's a slide, and that's the verse from 12:6, Revelation. And the woman fled into the wilderness where she hath the place prepared of God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. Okay. And when it's more than that, when it's more than that many years, you just start engaging in mathematics and mental gymnastics, and it comes out to Joseph Smith's time.
And I just want to know, and maybe you sort of have said, I just want to be clear. Givens loves this idea because it gives him the backing for all these things he's saying, which is that the church left mainstream Christianity, which would be Catholicism and the Orthodox Church, and it goes into the wilderness. It goes into hiding, and it shows up coincidentally, RFM, it shows up in the 23 books that Joseph Smith owned. That's where the woman fled to when she went into the wilderness. So what Givens is doing is saying, you don't need to look at this as plagiarism. This is the church of God going into the the ideas of minority authors whose ideas are not accepted in mainstream thought, and those books happen to land on Joseph Smith's shelf, and Joseph Smith knows by the power of God that these ideas in these 23 books is the gospel of Jesus Christ.
These are the ideas I need to steal.
These are the ones.
That's what God's telling him. Steal this, steal that, and crib over here.
And watch, this scripture alone gives Terryl Givens permission to do this whole thing.
And I don't think it does. I know he does it, but I don't think it gives him permission. Oh my gosh, it's crazy, because that is actually what Terryl Givens is arguing, is that God told Joseph what to steal from other churches, from other books, from other religions. And that's Mormonism. That's how Mormonism is the true restored church, as long as you understand restoration differently. And we'll get to that in a second.
Yeah, okay. I'll bite my
Well, would you read this? It looks very long and intimidating.
Quote, Joseph Smith was deep. Can I do it in Terryl Givens' voice?
I don't know. Can you?
Joseph Smith was deeply attuned to this record of lamentable failure to establish Zion both before and after the accomplishment of Enoch. But Smith believed that Enoch offered the model and blueprint for getting all the way to Zion. In 1795, the Scottish minister Alexander Fraser published his popular work Key to the Prophecies, which included a gloss on a passage in Revelation 12 that's nothing like Shakespeare, that was the especial interest to Protestants of the era.
And I'm going to break in for just a second and say, remember Alexander Fraser, the Scottish minister, Key to the Prophecies? That's one of the books that Terrell's going to have in the video at the end.
By the way, where does Terryl get the pseudo-British accent in his voice?
I think it's from his wife. She was raised in the Seychelles, I think. She has a delightful accent. And it's not the only way he resembles her. But we don't have to get into that, Bill.
And that passage is in the woman fled into the wilderness, where she hath a place prepared of God, where she is nourished for a time. In Fraser's interpretation, this prophecy of the woman in the wilderness refers to the time when, as the visible church declined from the doctrines and precepts of Christianity, the true church of Christ gradually retired from the view of men, till at length the Church of Christ, considered as a community, wholly disappeared.
That was
I think
very
I
nice.
went Irish there, by the way.
Yeah. I almost started dancing a jig. Here we go. He continues, sometime between 1795 and 1835, this is Terryl Givens writing about Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith enthusiastically embraced a kindred version of restoration as a reassemblage of a scattered rather than abandoned church in the wilderness. This is a complete redo of the entire concept of apostasy and restoration. Apostasy has always been, I know because I taught it as a missionary to a lot of Japanese people. Apostasy, at least in my lifetime, and back to the guy who wrote The Great Apostasy. I mean, Talmage, right? James Talmage. So over 100 years, this is what the apostasy has been, if not longer, in Mormonism. Tell me if this sounds familiar. Jesus Christ established his church. He called 12 men his apostles. He died. He got resurrected. He went up to heaven. The apostles went out to spread the gospel in all the earth. And one by one, they got killed off before they could assemble back together to call new apostles to take their stead. Thus, the apostles died out. The priesthood was taken from the earth, and the doctrines and ordinances were changed. That's the apostasy. Am I wrong? Okay. And the restoration is, 1800 years later, God opens the heavens and angels are sent down and God is coming down and Jesus is coming down and everybody's coming down from heaven. And they are telling Joseph Smith, this is the restoration. This is how it's supposed to be. This is what it used to be, but it got lost. We're giving it back to you because you are great. And that's Mormonism. That's the apostasy and the restoration. Now, once again, pay attention to what Terryl Givens is reframing it as. He's not only saying Joseph Smith is reframing it from what it is that we've always been taught. He's saying that Joseph Smith got it from somebody else in his environment, not from God. Sometime between 1795 and 1835, Joseph Smith enthusiastically embraced a kindred version of restoration as a reassemblage of a scattered rather than abandoned church in the wilderness. And he gives this example, by the way, and this is brilliant of him. In the 1835 edition of his Revelations, i.e. Doctrine and Covenants, first edition, Joseph Smith even changed the wording of the 1833 Book of Commandments, section 4. So this is one of those many places where the Book of Commandments from 1833, same revelations get republished in the Doctrine and Covenants 2 years later. And there's all these changes and additions and sometimes subtractions. Somebody's been mucking with the revelations of God in the intervening 2 years. That's what. So he's going to mention that here. He says he even changed the wording of the 1833 Book of Commandments, section 4, to reflect this new reading of Revelation 12, i.e. that he, Joseph, is to preside over the coming forth of my church out of the wilderness. So he adds out of the wilderness to it. If he were, in fact, influenced in this regard by Fraser, Terryl Givens writes, he may have read Fraser's further comments on the allegory. He's a smart fella.
Yeah. What I want to say here, RFM, is that there are so many instances in early Mormon history as Joseph Smith is building the church, building its theology, creating the Book of Mormon, creating the Book of Abraham, creating the Book of Moses, where let me take that off. Anyway, where we can see by what Joseph Smith is doing in that moment, and then we can also see what he is looking at, reading, translating alongside it. And once you understand sort of that's going on, for instance, you know that Joseph Smith has the Adam Clark commentary. We know he has it pretty early on, and there are references that show up all along the way. It's knowing that he had access to it that allows us to go like, boom. Not only is there the coincidence of 200 to 300 seeming apparent similarities, but we also know, Terryl Givens agrees, by the way, that Joseph Smith had Adam Clark's commentary. It's to the point where the church has to acknowledge in, I think it's footnote number 14, I might be mistaken on the number, on the Book of Abraham Gospel Topic essay that says, yes, Joseph Smith might have had the Book of Joseph and the Book of Jasher, whatever it was, but we don't know if he used it or not. Well, we do know because the ideas show up in the Book of Abraham, and that's the most rational explanation, rather than papyrus that's in a standard Egyptian funerary text just happens to be a catalyst that leads Joseph Smith to receiving the Book of Abraham, but he thinks that the papyri is the Book of Abraham and he's mistaken and God lets him be. See how much allowances and conjecture that idea needs. Yeah. Or you can just say it's a fraud and he's plagiarizing.
It's one thing to say that Joseph Smith came up with a crazy or creative idea, maybe a radical idea. It's another thing to say that he made it up, okay? So it's one thing to say he made it up, let's put it that way. It's another thing to say, hey, somebody else had written about this in a book. It's another thing to say that book was written and published before Joseph Smith came up with the idea. It's now another thing to say that it was in Joseph Smith's neighborhood. It was written in English. It's another thing to say that Joseph Smith actually had possession of the book, and we can prove it from other documents. That's pretty darn good evidence that the most rational idea is that if Joseph Smith came up with a radical idea in Mormonism, and it's over here in this book that was actually in his possession, he probably got it from that book that was in his possession.
Yeah. And Givens agrees.
Yeah. That's the unusual thing, except he wants to say that God is doing the instruction. God is he's like the kingpin. He's Wilson Fisk. That's God. He's directing all the crime organizations and where to steal and what to steal.
Yeah.
So going on, footnote 157. You see, I read the footnote sometimes. In footnote 157, Givens argues his point even more strongly. Now, here's what he's going to say, okay? And I apologize because it's helpful to me just to explain it before we read what he's saying, for me to understand what he's talking about. Believe me, I wish I'd had someone to explain to me what he was saying before I had to read it. What he's saying is this, is that his case is actually even stronger than what he has said, that Joseph Smith is borrowing from Fraser's book. Because Fraser not only refers to the lady going into the wilderness in Revelation 12 as the church of God, as we've already read, but he takes an unrelated phrase from the Old Testament in the Song of Solomon, which says, fair as the sun and clear as the moon and terrible as an army with banners. And Fraser takes that phrase and applies it to the woman who goes into the wilderness. Now, Terryl Givens notes that Joseph Smith does the exact same thing, which raises the evidence that Joseph Smith was getting his idea from Fraser, because this is becoming more and more coincidental and more similar in ways that we would not normally expect. Can you read this footnote, Bill?
Footnote number 157, Givens argues it more strongly. Further evidence of Smith's indebtedness to Fraser is that immediately following the language borrowed from Revelation 12, he adds to the Book of Commandments chapter 4, verse 5, section 4, verse 5, the same Solomonic.
He calls it Solomonic because it's from the Song of Solomon. We don't find that out until later.
The same Solomonic language Fraser employs about the church, clear as the moon and fair as the sun and terrible as the army with banners. We hear that phrase frequently in the Doctrine and Covenants, but it comes originally from the Song of Solomon 6:10. The key here being that it is Fraser who uses the Solomonic term to describe the church coming out of the wilderness, and Joseph apparently follows suit, changing the revelation to incorporate the same language as Fraser.
So you'll notice that in the main body of the book, Terryl Givens goes, we'll never know whether Joseph Smith got it from Fraser. And then he starts arguing, well, obviously he got it from Fraser. And then you go to the footnote 157, he's saying, damn right he got it from Fraser. That's why I included the footnote. So this is an important point for Givens to make. Givens has already, this is important, Givens has already redefined restoration as Joseph Smith being inspired to borrow and adopt all these different ideas in his milieu into his religion, Mormonism. Givens must therefore also redefine apostasy, not as a falling away, but as the true gospel and doctrines going underground. And he'll use that expression in the video coming up, going underground and being preserved in different avenues through different unnamed people and communities of religion who pass it on and pass it on and pass it on. Eventually gets written. And like you said, Bill, Joseph Smith happens to get them all the right books, and know which parts of which books are inspired. So he can steal them for Mormonism.
The pieces of truth in the sermons have to be in his neighborhood, his backyard. The pieces of truth in books happen to be on his bookshelf. The pieces of truth in the voids of the stories that he's filling in happen to be in his own subconscious. It really does become absurd when you sit, again, Givens says it in a way that he sort of ignores helping the audience come to the real conclusion. But when you understand how much conjecture and allowances are required for you to go like, it just happened to work out. Everybody's in the right place. All the books are on the right shelf. All the sermons are in the right neighborhood. Good golly, restoration, nailed it.
This is where Mormons have to go if they're honest about the evidence.
Yep.
This is the only conclusion left to them. Joseph Smith took all these unique doctrines from Mormonism from sources in his environment, but God inspired him to pick those. So once again, Givens must therefore also redefine apostasy, having redefined restoration. He must also therefore redefine apostasy, not as a falling away, but as the true gospel and doctrines going underground and being preserved in different avenues so as to be available in all these different sources in Joseph Smith's day for Joseph to draw upon in restoring Mormonism. That's the restoration now, according to Terryl Givens. By the way, apparently he's having some influence because there was that entire volume produced by the Neal A. Maxwell Institute, which is an arm of BYU, and you read it and you've talked about it before. Can you mention that book just a bit, Bill? The thumbnail on the apostasy?
Yeah. So the book from the Maxwell Institute is called Ancient Christians. I was going to try to find it here really quick. But essentially, this was a book put together by like 23 different authors. It was a numerous amount of authors. They each had a chapter each. And so, oops, I almost had it here. Let me grab this and put it over on that screen because because I think this is important. Let me.
I think I've had one too many throat lozenges.
Yeah, I don't.
Apologize.
Yeah, that's okay.
There we go.
Let's do that. Here's this. So, Ancient Christians. That's the book right there. An Introduction for Latter-day Saints. This is produced by the Maxwell Institute, edited by Jason Combs, Mark Ellison, Catherine Gines Taylor, and
Is that really only $94.95?
On eBay it is. I can
That's
check
a steal
it
at
is.
half the price.
And I've got it. It wasn't a cheap book, but I don't think it was that much. But what the book does, and I'll get off the Zoom here so you can see it better. What the book does is it has faithful, believing Latter-day Saints, allegedly, who they're basically writing a book in a arm of the church. The Maxwell Institute is part of the church. It's the entity that Elder Holland was speaking to over the last few years, telling them to that they've got to do a better job defending the church. What the book does is it says that the great apostasy didn't happen the way the LDS Church's theology claimed. That's the first point. The second point it makes is that Jesus Christ could not have created the early Christian church the way that LDS leaders taught that he did, because Jesus was a Jew. The first generation of Christians were Jews. The second generation of Christians weren't Christians. They were Jews. The Christian church doesn't happen until late into the second, early into the third generation of people who follow Christ. That's the second
Jesus never
point.
created a church. Exactly.
Yep. And then I think the most damning is point number 3, which is it isn't the way we think of the restoration is that Christ established a Christian church. It's got all the offices. It's got all the theology. It's got the temple endowment. The church apostatized. Joseph Smith comes along. He restores what the ancient church was. So Mormonism is the ancient church in effect. And what this book does is say, we got to scrap that idea. Whatever Mormonism is, it's certainly not early Christianity.
Because it's an effort by the apologetic, though scholarly arm of the church in order to try and bring Mormonism into line with scholarship. And it's what the scholarship is, not just now, but it's what it's been for decades, for crying out loud. You know how late the Mormon church is to any religious party or any kind of party. They're always going to be the last ones to show up. And the same is here. So once it becomes indisputable, God will send a revelation. I think that we completed that. Oh, example number 9, progression between kingdoms. I mean, this guy's kind of radical, Terryl Givens. Here's what he writes. The 3-tiered nature of the heaven Joseph Smith described has been taken by some to effectively replace one set of judgmental distinctions with another, i.e. one heaven and one hell versus 3 heavens and 1 hell, right? But Joseph Smith apparently believed that all entrance into heaven would progress through the levels to eventual fullness of glory. What are you saying, Terryl? And who is Terryl Givens referring to when he says some? This has been taken by some to effectively replace. In other words, no progression between kingdoms. He's saying that some people have thought that Joseph Smith taught there was no progression between kingdoms, but Joseph Smith was wrong because Terryl Givens understands the true nature of things. The problem is it's in contradiction to what the prophets are teaching and what they've been teaching for decades. So the prophets and apostles of the LDS Church are the people that Terryl Givens is referring to. Elder Bruce R. McConkie went so far as to list progression between kingdoms as one of his 7 deadly heresies in 1980. And you can see over there, it's number 5. Can you see that there, Bill? There's progression from one kingdom to another in the eternal worlds. That's heresy number 5. This is another example of Terryl Givens promoting a different gospel than church leadership. Yeah, I think Hiram did mention it. And he talked about people in the terrestrial kingdom, the sinner kingdom, eventually and over time filtering out either to the celestial or the telestial kingdom, and saying that's why the moon is given as its symbol, because it waxes and wanes. But that is the only place I've ever seen that. So it never caught on as far as I can tell. Anyway, I hope that's what you're referring to about Hiram. Example number 10, borrowing from the Joseph Smith translation into the D and C. So what he's going to say here, and I hope you'll read this here in a second, Bill. What he's going to say is that when Joseph Smith is working on his Joseph Smith translation, He'll be working on stuff, and then the ideas that he's working on in the Joseph Smith translation, all of a sudden and shortly thereafter, start showing up in the revelations that he's receiving that end up getting bound and published in the Doctrine and Covenants. And he gives a couple of examples of these. Can you read this, Bill?
Givens believes not only is Joseph Smith's restoration influenced by other ideas in his milieu, Givens argues that his Joseph Smith translation work ended up impacting the revelations he received from God that ended up being canonized in the Doctrine and Covenants. So not only is Joseph Smith being influenced by other ideas in Joseph's culture, but the revelations he receives in the D&C are themselves dependent on the Joseph Smith translation.
Right. Want to see an example of this? Read on, McDuff.
Quote, in August 1831, Smith was working through the text of Matthew 17, wherein Jesus taketh Peter, James, and John, his brother, and bringeth them up into the high mountain apart, and was transfigured before them. In Smith's mind, apparently the transfiguration of Christ elicited images of a future transfiguration of the entire earth, and he cast the connection between the two as a teaching the New Testament record omitted. In a revelation dictated that same month, he quotes the Savior, referring to the day yet to come, when the earth shall be transfigured, even according to the pattern which was shown unto my apostles upon the mount, of which account the fullness of which ye have not yet received. Of course not, but ye have not yet received.
Right. So you see what he's saying here? Matthew 17, Joseph Smith is working on his Bible translation, the JST. He gets to Matthew 17, we're talking about, or it's in Mark, we're about the transfiguration of Christ. Okay. See, I'm not sure because one says Matthew, one says Mark, and that may have been me misreading one or the other and then transcribing it correctly. Regardless, he's doing his JST. He gets to the transfiguration account, right? And this is where Jesus is being transfigured before the apostles, at least Peter, James, and John. And what Terryl Givens is saying is this gave Joseph Smith the idea. It prompted him to think of the entire earth being transfigured. Because in a revelation he receives that month, separate and apart from his JST. This isn't the Bible. This is just a revelation coming from God about stuff. Included in that revelation is not only the idea that the Savior, referring to a day yet to come when the earth shall be transfigured, is a concept he's now introducing into Mormonism. He's saying that it was part of the biblical record in Matthew 17, in the account of the transfiguration, but that got lost as well. So you don't have it among you. So at the same time, Joseph Smith is using a prompt from the Bible to come up with a new and elaborated doctrine of the entire earth being transfigured. From translating this passage in the New Testament, he's simultaneously creating another gap for himself to subsequently fill in with another story, which never apparently happened. Sometimes, Terrell writes, sometimes the influence of Smith's revision work, the JST, resulted in simple rhetorical borrowing. So just phrases like this one. In October 1831, he was working through the early chapters of Mark. In the third verse, John the Baptist preaches, "Prepare ye the way of the Lord, make his paths straight." Simple enough. That month, Smith dictated a revelation whose opening words were identical. "Prepare ye the way of the Lord, make his path straight." There seems to be an influence going on. And that Joseph Smith's works on the JST appears to be impacting the revelations he's receiving from God. By the way, I want to go back here and say, if it's Matthew 17 and that number's right, 17, it would not be Mark because Mark has 16 chapters. So I'm guessing it's Matthew throughout. Having said that, we'll move on. Can you read this next slide, Bill?
Yep. Quote, at other times, textual revisions in the JST struck him as important enough to recast as revelation in their own right. One such instance touched on the veracity of his own claim to see God in Jesus Christ.
This is big.
He was translating the Gospel of John, which says in its first chapter, "No man has seen God at any time." As noted earlier, Smith adjusted this text in his translation, making such a vision possible, but conditional and consistent with his own experience. He changed it to say, "No man hath seen God at any time," except he hath borne record of the Son. Smith then, by the way, there are numerous prophets in the Old Testament who claim to have some sort of visionary experience with God and don't testify of Jesus Christ at all.
True. Exodus 33:11.
Okay, so he changed it to say, no man hath seen God at any time, except he hath borne record of the Son. Smith then inserted that edited passage into a revelation, which further edits, for no man hath seen God at any time in the flesh, except quickened by the Spirit of God. D&C 65:1. Whether in the body or out of the body, I cannot tell.
So you see, this is not just saying that Joseph Smith changed the Bible in order to make it match his claim to have seen God. He's also showing and demonstrating how it is that change that Joseph Smith made in the New Testament, in the Bible, ends up being reflected in an otherwise unrelated revelation he's getting from God shortly thereafter. Okay? Okay. Let's go to the next one. Oh, no man has seen God at any time. Or has he? I'll give it a go. Another form of borrowing occurred when a New Testament injunction was particularly apt to the immediate situation of Smith's own flock. What he's going to say is that he's translating about how Jesus says, if you get offended or if no one receives you in the city, to his apostles or disciples, brush the dust off your feet. Leave that as a testimony against them. It will be more tolerable for Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment than for that city. Reading these words, as the calendar turned to 1831, Joseph Smith incorporated them into a January revelation. So the next month it shows up in a revelation, making the threat only slightly less anachronistic, because it's not brush the dust off your feet against them, and it will be more tolerable for them than Sodom and Gomorrah. It'll be more tolerable for them, for the heathen in that day. So in other words, it is less anachronistic, because you wouldn't say to your followers, it's be more tolerable for Sodom and Gomorrah. I guess you could, but he changed it to make it more generalized and thus more contemporary. So reading these words as the calendar turned to 1831, blah, blah, blah. And this is what he writes. And in whatsoever house, this is the revelation he receives after the translation of Mark. And in whatsoever house ye enter, and they receive ye not, ye shall depart speedily from the house. Shake the dust from off your feet as a testimony against them, and it shall be more tolerable for the heathen in the day of judgment than for that house. So there's another borrowing that Terryl Givens sees, and how Joseph Smith's translation of the Bible is impacting the revelations he's receiving in the Doctrine and Covenants. Are you able to read this, Bill?
Yeah, what Givens shows is that on multiple occasions, JST phrases and language end up being put into revelations from God. Now remember, much of the stuff that Joseph Smith is doing in the Joseph Smith translation is being borrowed from contemporary sources such as Adam Clark's commentary, and then things he learns by reading the experts of his day then make their way into the revelations of God. These are not just ways of phrasing things, Givens says. He says these are...
No, this is me, just so you know. There's no quotation marks. This is my summary.
These are not just ways of phrasing things. These are substantive messages, like shaking the dust from off your feet, or whether a person can see God. Not just Smith using his own language to couch the revelations of God, but the JST is actually influencing the ideas Joseph Smith is receiving by revelation from God. So who is really doing the revealing here? And why are these ideas on God's mind right after we know they were on Joseph Smith's mind because of the Joseph Smith translation?
Make sense?
Yeah, it's...
Oh, sorry.
The D&C is modern revelation in this day. Joseph Smith translation is a restoring of the corrupt Bible to its perfect form. And yet the overlap occurs at the exact moment when he's working on one and reading the other.
Yeah, and what Terryl Givens is saying is that Joseph Smith was influenced by everything. Writings, what's going on in his society, other people's religious ideas. Even his own Joseph Smith translation is influencing the revelations he's receiving from God. And as you said, a lot of his Joseph Smith translation, or at least a substantial and statistically important part of that translation ends up being connected to ideas that are in the Adam Clarke Bible commentary. Example number 11. This is the last one from his chapter, okay? I got a few more up my sleeve. Not only does he have examples of the Joseph Smith translation impacting the Doctrine and Covenants, right? It goes both ways. He even has one example, at least, of the Doctrine and Covenants revelation influencing Joseph Smith's translation of the Bible.
That seems out of place.
Well, yeah, it all does. But this seems, in other words, anything can influence anything in Joseph Smith's world. That's what Terryl Givens is demonstrating. Most intriguing of all the intertextual relations, which means borrowing or dependency, that emerged from Smith's work on the Bible are those between the Book of Moses and the September 1830 revelation, later published as Section 29 of the Doctrine and Covenants. This is brilliant. It takes a Terryl Givens to figure this out. He doesn't figure out exactly what it means, but he figures out. In conjunction with the evidence already presented, a look at this intertextuality, which means borrowing, allows us, look, if there's intertextuality between two books, the one that came later borrowed from the first book. That's what it's talking about, intertextuality, okay? In conjunction with the evidence already presented, a look at this intertextuality allows us to conceptualize Joseph Smith's revelatory imagination. I told you we used that expression. It allows us to conceptualize his revelatory imagination in new ways. The same revelation, Section 29, contained a number of unrelated and intriguing doctrinal innovations, radical doctrines, Mormonism, the good stuff. But this time, they seem to have anticipated rather than responded to his work with the Bible revision. So what he's saying there is his revelations aren't borrowing from his Joseph Smith translation. The Joseph Smith translation is now borrowing from an earlier revelation, i.e., the Joseph Smith translation borrows from the Revelations as well. In particular, the Genesis material that became the Book of Moses. A number of parallels in phrasing make the intertextuality clear. So he's going to talk about the Book of Moses and how it borrows from a revelation he received in September of 1830 before he commenced the translation of the Book of Moses, at least the parts he's talking about. Any thoughts, Bill?
Just what the comments on the screen. I think this is what we're trying to get at. It seems like Joseph Smith would read a word or a phrase from a book he read, then design a scripture around it. Or he would create a scripture in one place and then use it to fill in some other project he's working in. That's what I'll say.
Here, Givens, this is me again. Here, Givens gives a table in his book, which I can't replicate here because I can't find the book, in which he shows the corresponding parallels between D&C 29 and the Joseph Smith translation of Moses. These basically have to do with the description of the premortal existence, the rebellion of Satan in heaven, and the creation of all things spiritually before physically. Givens points out that the revelation in D&C 29 was given before Smith did his translation on the Book of Moses. And yet, Moses appears to be obviously borrowing phrases, the Book of Moses, borrowing phrases and expressions from D&C 29. Let's look at some of those. So D&C 29, the earlier revelation, it says the Lord created all things both spiritually and temporally. First spiritually, second temporal, right? What does the Joseph Smith translation of Moses say? All things were before created before, but spiritually were they created. A second instance, D&C 29 says, he, Satan, rebelled against me, saying, give me thine honor. I think it's in chapter 4 of the Joseph Smith translation of Moses, I should say, where it says, Satan came before me, saying, give me thine honor. We know the D&C section was earlier. The revelation received there was earlier than the Joseph Smith translation, and yet we're seeing such obvious signs of dependence, Bill.
Yeah, this is what I mean. We can see in time, in the chronology of the history of the church and the documentary history, we can see these moments where Joseph Smith is working on one thing, and then shortly after, or he's reading something, or he's involved in something, and then a week or 2 or 3 later, he's working on something else. And it just so happens to be the coincidence where those same phrases or ideas cross over. And when you get one of them, you go, that's a coincidence. You get 3 of them, maybe you go, that's a coincidence. But there's like a dozen of them minimum where we run into this, where we can go, Joseph's working on this with the Joseph Smith translation, and then he's working on this with the Book of Abraham. Joseph Smith is reading this book from his library, and then he has this idea. Joseph Smith gets this thing from Sidney Rigdon's in town, and Sidney says this, and now Sidney Rigdon's idea is in the theology. At some point, you have to break down and go, that's beyond coincidence. What appears to be happening is Joseph gets an idea in his mind in one place, and then within a short period of time, he takes what he thinks is a cool idea and he moves it over into some other project.
And what's he doing in between? He's thinking about it. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, and remember, this is Terryl Givens pointing out these similarities and arguing for what it means. Doctrine and Covenants 29 says they should not die, Adam and Eve, until I should send forth God speaking angels to declare unto Adam and Eve repentance and redemption through the name of mine only begotten Son. Joseph Smith translation of Moses, an angel of the Lord appeared unto Adam, saying, thou shalt repent and call upon God in the name of the Son. Once again, we see dependency. Doctrine and Covenants 29, children are redeemed from the foundation of the world. Joseph Smith translation of Moses, children are whole from the foundation of the world.
I'm going to say this again just so people are clear. For anybody who's a believer listening to this episode, you might go, well, yeah, like that's an idea over here from God and that's an idea over there from God. No, the ones we're pointing out are close in relationship to chronological time. With Joseph Smith's working on D&C 29, at the same time, he's working on Joseph Smith translation Moses. And so when one phrase shows up in a revelation that God gives Joseph Smith on D&C, and then 2 weeks later, it makes its way into the Joseph Smith translation of Moses, you have to pause and go, why does that seem to be happening over and over again? It's not just that there's a phrase that's common, it's that they're close in time in the projects that Joseph Smith is working on or things that he's reading or familiar with in his milieu. I can't hear you, RFM.
So for the sake of clarity and accuracy, which is always important, though I don't want to get further off in the weeds, I think Joseph Smith started his translation of the Bible in June of 1830, starting with Moses 1. And that is fine for everything else that Terryl Givens is talking about, except for section 29, which was in September of 1830 when it was received. The parts of Moses, it wasn't all done in June. It went on through December, okay? And maybe around the corner there into January of 1831. What I'm saying is that the parts of the Book of Moses that Terryl Givens is picking out to show this dependency were translated after September of 1830 and after D&C 29 was received. Okay?
Hence, one is dependent on the other, but in the opposite order as the previous examples.
Yes, exactly. Which is strange, but there it is. Here's another example, D&C 29, and it must be that the devil should tempt the children of men, or they could not be agents unto themselves. And the Joseph Smith translation of Moses says, and it is given unto them to know good from evil, wherefore they are agents unto themselves. So example number 12, history influences Joseph's revelations. This is something that Terryl Givens talked about in another place, but this one really blew my mind. Because the standard apologetic argument having to do with Joseph Smith's Civil War prophecy, section 87 of the Doctrine and Covenants, it was received December 25th, 1832, I believe it was. Certainly there was a secession crisis going on in 1832, and that's demonstrated by the historical record. So what the critic says, this is just responding to what's going on in Joseph Smith's own country, right? It's on the headlines of every newspaper that there's a secession crisis going to happen. So, of course, he's going to receive a revelation that's going to confirm that's going to happen in the near future, which is section 87. But the Civil War doesn't happen until 1861, right? So that's almost 30 years later, okay? The history of this revelation is that it was not published immediately. And it was not published until 1851, when it was published as part of the original edition of the Pearl of Great Price. It used to be in there. Now it's a section of the Doctrine and Covenants. But it was published in 1851, which is 10 years before the Civil War. Okay, so the apologetic argument is Yeah, there was a lot of talk about secession back in 1832 when the revelation is received. But by 1851, when the revelation was published, nobody was talking about secession anymore. And so the church believed in the authority and the prophetic ability of Joseph Smith. They published this thing. Lo and behold, it comes true 10 years later. That's the apologetic response. The problem is that Terryl Givens now blows that up and says it was even more of a concern secession was in 1851 than it had been in 1832. Givens undermines this argument as well, writing that there was another secession crisis going on in 1851 that was even worse than in 1832. Could you read this, Bill? And this is, no, it's not here. It'll be in the next slide that I have to correct. Go ahead, please.
The revelation dated 1832, section 87 in current editions, was equally tied to millennialist concerns, but expressed with rather more risk, i.e., because of the details. In this heretofore unpublished prophecy.
I'm sorry. I'm just saying that Terryl Givens is saying this is with more risk. And I put i.e., there's more risk because he gives the details about what's going to happen. And he actually says this is going to happen. And the southern states and the northern states, it's going to start in South Carolina. So it's a riskier prophecy.
Right, because Joseph Smith is giving specific details. Right. In this heretofore unpublished prophecy, Smith clearly referred to a civil war that would soon break out in America. The southern states shall be divided against the northern states, and the southern states will call on other nations, even the nation of Great Britain, to defend themselves. This was
perhaps Smith's boldest public assertion of his ability to foretell future events, and his prediction that war was soon to be poured out upon all nations. This conviction would have seemed even more reasonable. This is what Terryl Givens writes. This conviction that war is about to be poured out upon all nations would have seemed even more reasonable in 1851 than in 1832. He writes, Europe had just gone through the revolutionary convulsions of 1848, and the Missouri Compromise of 1820 was perpetuating a fragile stability at home. He actually wrote the Missouri Compromise of 1850. I looked it up and saw it was 1820, so I changed it. But it was actually 1850 because there was a separate amendment, a separate Missouri Compromise in 1850. So the year before they published this revelation, things look even worse for America staying together as a union, for the United States holding together, that there's not going to be civil war. It looks even worse in 1851 than it had in 1832. So that apologetic argument got exploded for me and for all the other apologists, courtesy of Terryl Givens. This is how committed he is to this. He will do his own research. He'll bring up things that people haven't brought up before to show these connections that Joseph Smith's borrowing from in his own milieu. And he just seems happy as a clam to do it, even though he's exploding testimonies right and left. Some concluding thoughts from Terryl Givens. Could you read this, Bill?
So a process that commenced in September 1830 with moments of insight, spontaneous glimpses of past worlds and events, fragmentary eruptions of God's voice.
Can I tell you what the hell eruptions means?
Yeah,
I had
he's
to look
using
it
the
up.
big word. Yep.
Eruptions means a violent breaking into. I think it's sort of the reverse of eruption. This is IRRUPTIONS for those of you listening at home. So an eruption is a breaking into, and an eruption is a breaking out of.
Yes. So a process that commenced in September 1830 with moments of insight, spontaneous glimpses of past worlds and events, fragmentary eruptions of God's voice, and inspired pronouncements. All these things pass through a period of incubation during which Joseph Smith's prophetic imagination sorts out, synthesizes, and weaves the scattered fragments into the mythic narratives that constitute his most important revelatory text.
Did he actually write that? He did. He said all these things, all these different influences in Joseph Smith's environment pass through a period of incubation in Joseph Smith's head, during which Joseph Smith's prophetic imagination sorts out, synthesizes, and weaves the scattered fragments into the mythic narratives that constitute his most important revelatory texts. These aren't just side issues. These are the most important basic issues that distinguish Mormonism from any other religion. And he's saying Joseph Smith took them from other sources in his environment, and he thought about them, and then his prophetic imagination went to work, and he put them all together, and it's Mormonism.
Prophetic imagination and mythic narratives. Givens finishes off something similar to these workings of the prophetic imagination is evident in the most controversial of all Joseph Smith's productions, the Book of Abraham.
And then he's going to go to the Book of Abraham. You were talking about all the different influences that scholars have noted that Joseph Smith used in Mormonism, in the Book of Mormon, and here and there, all over the place, right? Tonight's episode is only on the connections with Joseph Smith's translation of the Book of Moses. That's it. That's all we're talking about. In other words, a tiny little part of the output of Joseph Smith's prophetic imagination. And we are at 1 hour and 50 minutes, and we'll be over the 2-hour mark before we're done. But we're very close now. At this point, I have to bring up something very, very important. Oh, here's another concluding thing. Givens is saying that Joseph Smith was widely read. He's going to say that. And that he took ideas he got from his reading, from his environment, even from events going on around him, and using his revelatory imagination, cobbled them all together into what became Mormonism. How is this faith promoting? That's what I want to ask. Terryl, tell me. It sounds like Givens has identified the resources Joseph used to create Mormonism, and he has. But Givens would say Joseph was inspired to borrow these particular ideas as opposed to others. This, I conclude, is a charitable interpretation. Lucky number 13. Joseph Smith translation influences Joseph's own history. This is the one I wanted to get out here. This is so important. This is new. This wasn't covered in the last one that I did about Terryl Givens 5 years ago. Can you start to read this, please, Bill? I'm sorry.
Yeah, and stop me where you need to. Lucky number 13. Joseph Smith translation influences Joseph's own history. Now, let me posit a 13th influence of the Joseph Smith translation. Givens showed how outside works influenced Joseph Smith's revelations, and then showed how the revelations influenced the Joseph Smith translation, and even how the reverse is true, that the subject matter of the Joseph Smith translation would also influence the revelations. He even showed how history influenced the Joseph Smith translation.
By that, I mean our history, his current events at the time, Civil War, separation, secession crisis.
With this in mind, I'm going to go one step further and suggest that the Joseph Smith translation influenced how Joseph Smith envisioned his own history, and specifically how the Joseph Smith translation influenced Joseph Smith's first vision account.
Look out there, Joe. You're going to get burned. Could you read this too? I'm sorry, Bill.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to. Number 1, Joseph Smith's first vision accounts, even the earliest, came after the Joseph Smith translation of Moses chapter 1. Number 2, Joseph Smith's first recorded account in 1832 does not include Satan and includes only a plea for forgiveness. But by the time Smith is recording the official version in 1838, it sounds a lot like the encounter Moses has with Satan and God in Moses chapter 1. Number 3, in the 1838 first vision, Joseph goes to pray and encounters an evil presence of darkness that seeks to overcome him and prevent him from gaining access to God. Joseph overcomes this, and God and Jesus appear to him in a pillar of light and give him the knowledge he desires. Number 4, in Moses chapter 1, Moses first speaks to God face to face, but God then withdraws. Then comes Satan, pretending to be Jesus and wanting Moses to worship him. But Moses refuses. Satan gets angry and threatens to destroy Moses. Moses is very scared, but ultimately casts Satan out, and God appears again to speak to him face to face and give him the information he wants. Number 5, the first vision omits Moses' initial encounter with God and begins with the satanic oppression but from there quite similar.
Does that make sense as a synopsis and a comparison, Bill?
It makes sense in terms of those points being true. I would like you to explain to the audience what it is you're trying to convey, though. I can't hear you.
Okay, then, well, let's give a couple of examples of interesting parallels beyond that, which is the fear that is induced by the presence of Satan, which I suppose one might think, well, that's natural. Of course, you're going to be scared if Satan shows up. But here's Joseph's fear of Satan on the left, which is from the Joseph Smith history in the Pearl of Great Price, the 1838 account of his first vision, then compared with Moses chapter 1, verse 20, where Moses experiences the same thing. And actually, could you read Moses' fear of Satan on the right first? Because this is what was recorded first in time.
Yeah. So in chronological timeline, this came first, Moses' fear of Satan. And it came to pass that Moses began to fear exceedingly. And as he began to fear, he saw the bitterness of hell. Nevertheless, calling upon God, he received strength. And he commanded, saying, "Depart from me, Satan, for this God only will I worship, which is the God of glory."
And after that, there's an argument, and then Satan gets all angry and starts making the earth shake. And Moses gets even more scared, but finally he casts Satan out and God shows up. Okay. So comparing that to Joseph Smith's 1838 first vision account.
You want me to read that one too? Okay. "But exerting all my powers to call upon God to deliver me out of the power of this enemy, which had seized upon me. And at the very moment when I was ready to sink into despair and abandon myself to destruction, not to an imaginary ruin, but to the power of some actual being from the unseen world, who had such marvelous power as I had never before felt in any being. Just at this moment of great alarm, I saw a pillar of light exactly over my head above the brightness of the sun, which descended gradually until it fell upon me."
Okay. There's also this idea of the immense fatigue felt after a vision of God. And if you could do the same thing on the right, Moses is fatigued after his vision of God, which we find that's the first vision of God, right? In Moses chapter 1. That's why it's in verses 9 and 10. And then read on the left Joseph's 1838 account of his first vision about the fatigue Joseph felt after that first vision.
When was the book of Moses being worked on?
June 1830.
June of 1830.
Moses 1, the first chapter. Yeah.
Okay. Moses fatigued after the vision. "And the presence of God withdrew from Moses, that his glory was not upon Moses, and Moses was left unto himself. And as he was left unto himself, he fell into the earth. And it came to pass that it was for the space of many hours before Moses did again receive his natural strength, like unto man. And he said unto himself, Now for this cause I know that man is nothing, which thing I never had supposed."
So he's out for several hours. He can't even stand up. He's so fatigued, weakened by enduring the presence of God. Joseph does something similar in his 1838 account of the first vision.
"He again forbade me to join with any of them, and many other things did he say unto me, which I cannot write at this time. When I came to myself again." By the way, what's more important than writing down all these things at this time? Like, you had an angelic visitation, and what Joseph is saying is, I'm going to give you a few things. I don't have enough time to give you all of it. But that to me is insane, RFM. You just spoke to heavenly beings. You should be, if it takes you 6 weeks, you should sit down, have someone bring you food, and you should write down every damn thing that happened in that interaction.
Unless by cannot, he means he's been directed, shall not, by the angel.
There we go. God. Isn't that convenient? "He again forbade me to join."
It also creates additional gaps to be filled in later, like with what Moroni told him. In 1838, Joseph Smith will say, "Moroni told me that my name should be had for good and evil among all nations." But that's the first time it's mentioned.
So if it's true that he was forbidden to write it down, he still wrote it down later on, some of it at least.
Well, yeah, I guess so.
Okay. "Joseph fatigued after the vision. He again forbade me to join with any of them, and many other things did he say unto me, which I cannot write at this time." Not at this time. "When I came to myself again, I found myself lying on my back, looking up into heaven, and when the light had departed, I had no strength, but soon recovering, in some degree, I went home.
So both Moses and Joseph have this fatigue after their vision. What I am suggesting, in case you haven't figured it out by now, is that the Joseph Smith translation influenced not only revelations received by Joseph Smith, as argued by Terryl Givens, but that it also influenced Joseph's telling of his own history, as if his history were not something that actually and literally happened to him, but a text he could write any way he wanted, and using whatever influence that appealed to his prophetic imagination.
Yeah, and I just want to make a note here. In the next one, we can turn it to that.
Okay.
So there have been throughout tonight's episode, there have been believers in the chat, and they're irritated. They want to stand up for their church. They want the church to be true. They're really bothered.
Tell it to Terryl.
I know they're really bothered by the things that Terryl Givens has claimed and that we're reiterating tonight.
Yeah,
and
I understand.
There's this thing in Mormonism where, in the Book of Mormon, if someone was an antichrist, the prophet of the Book of Mormon could extend a request to heaven and mute that person. Well, I'm going to work this in reverse. I'm going to work this in reverse tonight. So for all the believers in the audience, I'm going to ask you to use your voice in the chat and to respond to this. And my guess is that for the most part, you're going to be muted because you're not going to be able to respond to this. So what RFM is saying is that Joseph Smith is taking things from the projects he's working on and conveniently putting them into those same sort of thematic materials into his own personal telling of his story. And you could go, well, that's just a coincidence. But this isn't the only time Joseph Smith has done this. And here's what I would want you to respond to. So on the screen are two images. One on the left is Book of Mormon, Mormon chapter 9, verse 24. On the right there, on the left-hand side, the right-hand column of that left-hand image is the King James Holy Bible, Mark 16, verses 17 through 18. Here's the point. That the author of the Book of Mormon, who is not only separated by time, he's writing before the New Testament writers. No, sorry, he's writing after the New Testament writers are writing, but he's never met them. He doesn't know them. He's on a completely different continent. He's separated by them. He is writing in Reformed Egyptian, whereas the New Testament authors are writing in Hebrew. Then it's translated into Greek. Then it's translated into English. Reformed Egyptian, by the gift and power of God, is translated into English. Strangely, what Mark is alleged to be saying in chapter 16, verse 17, is exactly the same thing that Mormon or Moroni, I think it's Mormon, but are saying in Mormon chapter 9, verse 24. Almost identical. That shouldn't be. You would have to come up with an explanation that God's giving the same revelation to both, even though it's different languages, even though one is being translated through one language and then to another by earthly experts, and the other is by the gift and power of God. It just so happens to come out the same, but you have a secondary problem, which is
before you get to the secondary problem, Bill, which I think is fascinating. Here, let's do this. You read the Book of Mormon. I'll read from Mark at the same time, okay?
Okay, ready?
Yeah.
And these signs shall follow them that believe in my name.
In my name shall they cast out devils.
They shall speak
with new tongues.
They shall take up serpents. And if they drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them. They shall lay hands on the sick, and they shall recover.
That's word for word identical. There is no variation between the two.
It shouldn't happen. But then you have a secondary problem, which is that the original book of Mark ends with chapter 16, verse 9. Everything, and that's where the tomb is empty, and Mark goes, tomb's empty, it's up to you to decide. And someone way later on said, we can't leave it like that. That Jesus, he came out of that tomb. We got to fill in the void here. We have to do what Joseph Smith's going to do lots of years later, which is there's a void in the story. We need to insert something in, and verses 10 through whatever, I think it's 18 might be the last one, but verses 10 through whatever are filled in. It wasn't part of the original New Testament, and it wasn't a God-called prophetic author who's filling it in. It's just somebody's filling it in.
And when you look at it, as scholars have done long before me, when you look at the long ending, the added part to Mark that includes Jesus showing up, instead of just the women going out to the tomb to take care of the body, the tomb's empty, but there's like this guy there saying Jesus is raised into heaven, and the women flee in fear. Boom, close curtain. That's the original Book of Mark. That's where it ends, at least according to the consensus of scholars on the New Testament, based upon the manuscript evidence that exists. But if you look at the ending of Luke and the ending of Matthew and even the ending of John, where Jesus does show up, you can actually see the phrases and the pieces that are being borrowed from those gospels to make the story at the end of Mark longer and more complete and have Jesus showing up as a resurrected being.
Yes. And then the second one here is that we have Paul the Apostle in 1 Corinthians 12, 5 through 11, giving the exact same rhetoric, the exact same stuff, minus a little bit here or there, but no one's going to argue that these two are too similar to just explain away.
It's the gifts of the Spirit.
Yeah. Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, 5 through 11 is saying the exact same thing that Moroni in chapter 10, verses 8 through 14 and 16 and 17 in the Book of Mormon is saying. Again, these two guys don't have any connection to each other. There's a separation of languages, geography, time, space. It's all of it. So for the believers in the crowd, how does this happen? And I'm going to ask you, what is the most rational explanation? And the most rational explanation is that Joseph Smith is taking a scripture in the New Testament and it fills in nicely where he's working in the Book of Mormon. And he just copies it over, makes a few changes in the one, no changes in the other, and portrays it as if it came out of someone else's mouth.
This is the evidence. And the question is, what conclusion will you draw from this evidence? I avoided the obvious conclusion for decades as a Mormon, and I wish you more luck than I had.
Yeah. Good luck. All right, that's that. So
okay, so finally, this is actually the one that I wanted to say, which I think is for the first time. I might have said it once before, but now I've got the context to present it, okay? It's very simple, though. We can demonstrate from the historical record that Joseph Smith's ideas in his own head end up in God's mouth. Okay, really quick. In Joseph Smith's 1832 first vision account, he is clear that it is through his own study and before he goes to the grove to pray that Joseph concludes all the churches are wrong and in a state of apostasy. Here's what he says. 1832 account, first account, own handwriting. By searching the scriptures, I found that mankind did not come into the Lord. By searching the scriptures, I found this out, but that they had apostatized from the true and living faith. And there was no society or denomination that built upon the gospel of Jesus Christ as recorded in the New Testament. So this is really the huge difference between the 1832 account and the 1838 account, because in the 1838 account, Joseph has no idea about this, and he goes to the grove to pray. And this is the question he has for God: which church should I join? So the 1832 account, he already knows from his own study that there's no church he should join because they've all apostatized. In that account, 1832, he goes to ask for forgiveness. Okay. So what we end up with is that this idea, which we know or understand from Joseph Smith's 1832 account, was his own idea. This is Joseph Smith's own idea that he had, not through revelation, but through his own study, right? 6 years later, in 1838, Joseph puts his own thoughts into God's mouth. Can you read 18 and 19? I've highlighted 19, but I think you'll see what I mean.
My object in going to inquire of the Lord was to know which of all the sects was right, that I might know which to join. No sooner, therefore, did I get possession of myself so as to be able to speak, Then I asked the personages who stood above me in the light, which of all the sects was right. For at this time it had never entered into my heart that all were wrong.
That's huge. Joseph
which-
Smith puts that as a parenthetical statement. That's Joseph Smith in 1838 telling us, in contradiction to his 1832 account, at this time, when he goes in to pray, it had never entered into my heart that all were wrong. All what? All the sects, which means all the churches, all the religious denominations, and which I should join. He's going to ask God which one he should join, because he doesn't know that God's going to tell him in this account that they're all wrong. So he's going to ask him which I should join.
By the way, the 1832 account says the opposite of that. He already knew they were wrong. Okay, well, I didn't finish that though. By the way, RFM.
Okay, I was just going back to the 1832 account, in case you wanted to reference it. There you go.
I gotcha. Okay, so 18. So it's almost like he forgot. Like, oh, that's right. I did that other first vision account in 1832. What did I say around that one? Was there one Lord? Was there two? Did I already know which churches were wrong? Did I not?
Having made a study of Joseph Smith, I think those are the questions that were the furthest from his mind at any point during his life.
Yeah.
I don't think he was really concerned about making what he was teaching correspond to what he had taught earlier.
Yeah. By the way, I agree, Richard. He should have ponderized his first first vision a little more before he gave his second and third account. Verse 19, I was answered that I must join none of them, for they were all wrong. And the personage who addressed me said that all their creeds were an abomination in his sight.
And that's fine. That's enough. That's enough. So that's the evidence between the two. So what I'm saying is, yeah, Joseph Smith's own ideas in an earlier account of his first vision get put into God's mouth in a subsequent account of the same vision. So even we can document that even Joseph Smith's own ideas influence revelations he receives and history that he has experienced.
Yeah, let me see if am I right in saying that what you just said is that what Joseph Smith claimed was his own perspective in 1832 now becomes he becomes unknowing of that perspective in 1838, and that perspective becomes what God knows, what God's perspective is in 1838.
Yes.
Yeah.
God does not seem to know anything beyond what Joseph knows. And what Joseph knows, we've demonstrated, can influence what God knows.
Yeah.
Okay. Summary. The Joseph Smith translation was influenced by the Bible. The Joseph Smith translation was influenced by the writings and ideas of others. The Joseph Smith translation was influenced by the revelations Joseph was receiving. The revelations Joseph was receiving influenced the Joseph Smith translation. The revelations that Joseph was receiving were influenced by things happening around Joseph Smith in his environment, like the secession crisis. Joseph Smith's own history was influenced by the Joseph Smith translation. And number 7, Joseph Smith's own ideas influenced what God tells him. This is how Joseph Smith created Mormonism. In answer to the title of this episode, which is how Joseph Smith created Mormonism. This is how he did it. Once again, if you disagree with me, your argument's not with me, it's with Terryl Givens, except maybe for the last point or two, which I think are pretty good. Now, Terryl Givens' recent video, we finally got into it. Here's the amazing thing about this video. We're just going to play some clips. It's only 9 minutes long. If you were to watch this, for whatever reason, you might not think there was anything remarkable about it. It's when we've gone for 2 hours to explain to you exactly how radical, how unorthodox, how heterodox Terryl Givens' ideas are about Joseph Smith getting things from his environment, right? That you will understand, I think, better what it is he's saying in this video. He's saying the same damn thing. He's still singing the same song. He'll talk about these books that Joseph Smith had. He'll talk about where Joseph Smith got his ideas. He'll even talk about the apostasy as going underground instead of get the curtain coming down. This video put up 5 days ago at the Maxwell Institute YouTube channel. This means it's going up under official LDS Church imprimatur. It's only 9 minutes long. In it, you will see Givens continues to propound his theory that Joseph was influenced by others in pretty much everything he produced. You will also hear him articulate his theory that the apostasy was not a falling away, but a going underground. And I think we're here at this video, which we will interrupt. We're not going to play the whole thing, but wait till you see it. And all of a sudden, this thing's going to be open for you like a book. You're going to be able to see through this like saran wrap.
Hi, I'm Terryl Givens. I'm a senior research fellow here at BYU's Maxwell Institute, and I'm going to talk for the next few minutes about Joseph Smith's library. In Nauvoo,
library.
Before the martyrdom, Joseph Smith led efforts to create a formal institution, the Nauvoo Library, and we actually have the records that list the personal collection of Joseph Smith that he donated as a kind of foundation to the Nauvoo Public Library. And so one of my hobbies over the last few years has been to try to reconstitute as fully as I can the books that Joseph Smith bequeathed to the library. And so I have here with me a number of volumes that are, in some cases, I believe the identical editions that Joseph Smith owned. And we learned several really remarkable things from this document that gives us the list of titles that Joseph donated. We learned, first of all, how eclectic his tastes and interests were. And, you know, his mother once said that Joseph didn't read widely, but he read deeply. And I think in some ways he read much more widely than we have appreciated.
Can you stop it right there? Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, so I'll just note the apologetic argument in some, again, this is sort of like tight translation, loose translation. Sometimes apologists want Joseph Smith to be brilliant and smart. Sometimes they want him to be a country bumpkin buffoon. And when they need him to be a buffoon, an uneducated farm boy buffoon, they pull out Lucy Mack Smith's history, the history of Joseph Smith by his mother and the progenitors of Joseph Smith. It has a long title. And she says in there that Joseph was much more given to reflection and deep study, had never read the Bible through by course in his life, and was less inclined to the study of books than any of the other Smith children. Terryl Givens here is saying, well, I know mom said that, but she's wrong. Joseph Smith seems to be pretty well read. He's got a library of books. His hunch, Terryl Givens' hunch, is that Joseph Smith is reading a hell of a lot more than mom is putting on.
Right. And I think Terryl would admit that obviously he's talking about a different time in Joseph Smith's life in the 1840s when he's in Nauvoo establishing a library versus before he's produced the Book of Mormon in 1829 by dictation. And yet he makes the point. So that's what he said.
It should die. The idea that anything Lucy Mack says should be taken as the truth. There are other issues with her book. We should just note that Joseph Smith may not and likely was not as little read as Lucy is putting on.
Right. Lucy is not in on the con, but she's in on the legend making, the myth making of Joseph Smith. Just like Emma was with her declaration that Joseph Smith at this time couldn't write a well-worded letter when we know damn well he could because we've got them. Okay. And part of that myth making is making Joseph as dumb as possible and making the Book of Mormon as fantastic as possible to create a gap as big as you can between the two, Joseph Smith's abilities and the Book of Mormon, so that God can fit in between.
Yeah, another example of this really quick, RFM. You hit on this recently, and I thought it was just such a brilliant insight. I don't know if it came from you or if you were reiterating it from someone else.
I'll claim it.
That's good. It was the idea that Emma Smith, in talking about Joseph Smith's translation of the Book of Mormon, said, Joseph just didn't, this wasn't him doing this. When we were translating the Book of Mormon, he looks over at me and he asked, like, does Jerusalem have walls? And I had to be the one to tell him that, Jerusalem had walls because the Book of Mormon says so. Well, Emma's helping with the translation, but it's the part that's the 116 pages that are lost. The mention of walls in Jerusalem happens if we base our decision on the Mosiah priority, happens later on in the translation and would not have been Emma Smith. Now, it is just occurring to me, by the way, we can leave open room that the 116 pages have a similar phrase to them. That's possible.
Right, because it's going to be the same story. They're still leaving Jerusalem. They're waiting outside the walls as Nephi goes in to kill Laban and steal his things.
Yeah. But I'll add, we have another instance, which is that when Emma Smith is asked later about polygamy by her son, she denies it, but seems to reference it to other people. William McClellan, who comes to talk to her, she seems to obscure material from certain people that she's speaking to and seems to say it in others. She wants to portray Joseph Smith a certain way. This is Joseph Smith's mother. We should expect that she wants to protect the
legacy
of her son, Joseph Smith.
Right. Absolutely. She does, out of the best intentions.
Yeah.
And what Terryl Givens is saying, yeah, she said that, but I'm telling you, he read a lot of books, because we got the list of the books he's donated, and I've gone through them, and I'm going to tell you what's in them and what Joseph Smith took from him.
And the thing that impresses me most about his personal library collection was how interested he was in other faith traditions and in their teachings. And we find, for example, in the books that he donated, 2 books that come from the Catholic tradition. We generally assume that Catholics didn't make many inroads in the New England or New York. Joseph Smith, of course, the very, very last words he uttered in a public sermon were, "The old Catholic Church has more truth than all the rest." So he obviously knew enough about Catholicism to appreciate it. This is one of the books he owned. It's called The Catholic Man.
By the way, how can one entity have more truth than all the rest when God said all their creeds were an abomination before me, right? Like, it's the idea that everything about them is not right.
That's
and
right.
Yet Joseph has a separate idea that Catholicism has a lot of right to it.
I know. And Joseph Smith had the book. Otherwise, he couldn't have donated it. There's a lot of stuff in there. And I hear what you're saying. But he certainly, at the same time as he's showing how Joseph Smith is using these ideas, he's also using them in such a way as to support his own understanding of the apostasy and restoration.
Yeah.
Containing a selection of prayers, instructions, and devout exercises for Roman Catholics. And so we find everything from masses for the dead to an explanation of different Catholic festivals, how they're celebrated and why they're celebrated. He had a book by a popular preacher by the name of James Hervey, and he was a Methodist. And he had a collection, Joseph Smith has a collection called it's a collection of sermons called Meditations and Contemplations of the Reverend James Hervey. So we've got Methodism and Catholicism represented. We have...
Hey, Bill, I'm going to stop there for just a second. I just want to note that I think most people who know what they're talking about have gone to the Book of Mormon, looked at the sermons contained in the Book of Mormon, and have concluded that these are quite similar to the Methodist sermons that were being given in Joseph Smith's neighborhood as well. Joseph Smith, before the Book of Mormon, attended Methodist Sunday school. He was an exhorter. He gave speeches and sermons himself. Just wanted to mention that while he was talking about this Methodist book.
Yeah.
Called Parker's Lectures on Universalism. We know that there were Universalists in Joseph Smith's family background, and he owned at least 2 books that consisted of lectures on universalism.
You can stop there for a second. Universalism means that ultimately everybody's going to be saved. That's what it means. The Book of Mormon is not universalist. In fact, it's anti-universalist. It's very strictly heaven, one hell. But by a couple years, 3 years has rolled by, Joseph Smith is getting Section 76 in 1832, February 16th, 1832, about the vision of the degrees of glory, which ultimately is that basically, with some very rare and notable exceptions, everybody's going to go to heaven. It just may be different glories, which is much closer to the universalist idea than is the one heaven, one hell idea. And finally, I'm going to say that Terryl Givens' interpretation of Joseph Smith, which is different from Bruce R. McConkey's, I can tell you that, or any other church leader I know, that everybody will end up in the celestial kingdom, that is universalism. Sorry, I came to a period without any advance notice.
Which is that Joseph was serious when he understood the Lord to say, there are holy men and women ye know not of. And when, of course, he founded the School of the Prophets. And in the School of the Prophets, they studied languages and peoples and geography and history. And Joseph's understanding of restoration, as I understand Joseph Smith to have written about it, was that in addition to restoring a priesthood authority that was lost, he understood that he was under a mandate to gather together, to assimilate, to correct many of the beautiful truths of the gospel that hadn't disappeared from the earth. They had just gone underground.
Underground. So these teachings that were restored never disappeared. They just went underground, and now they're popping up their heads in these books, and Joseph Smith is going along and collecting them like daffodils in his restoration basket.
And I think one way in understanding Joseph Smith's view of apostasy comes from a work that I think he read, although we don't know that this was in his library.
Remember the one I told you to remember? Fraser?
By a Scottish theologian, and it's called Prophecy, A Key to the Prophecies.
That's it.
And in this volume, there is a phrasing that Joseph Smith will adopt and use 3 different times in the Doctrine and Covenants. Alexander Fraser is talking about Revelation chapter 12, which Joseph Smith tells us was an allegory of the apostasy. And in Alexander Fraser's telling, he emphasizes the words that Book of Revelation chapter 12 tells us that the church didn't disappear, that it fled into the wilderness where it was nourished of the Spirit. And then at a certain day, it comes forth out of the wilderness. And that's the language Joseph will repeatedly use in the Doctrine and Covenants and elsewhere. He will refer to the church coming out of the wilderness, which I take to mean that part of his task was to assemble these scattered fragments of beautiful gospel truths that had been marginalized or survived underground, and reassemble them into a more complete gospel wholeness. And so that language comes from this book, Alexander Fraser.
Do you have any thoughts there, Arthur?
I wasn't making it up. Exhibit A, okay? If you didn't believe my quotes that I was quoting from the book he wrote in 2019, this is him saying it less than a week ago, that Joseph Smith collected all this stuff from his environment and brought it together in order to create Mormonism.
And, Terryl Givens, I believe he's used the phrase eclectic aggregator which essentially means the same thing.
Isn't that Anthony Miller?
Anthony said that, but I think Terryl said it as well.
Did he? Okay.
And the other word that I know Terryl has used is bricolage.
Yes, and a bricoleur is apparently a person who engages in bricolage, which sounds like it should be against the law of chastity.
It's like when Thomas Wayment takes plagiarism and decides to use the phrase direct borrowing. Just tell us what it is, Terryl Givens uses this phrase bricolage. This was somebody who went to a presentation that Givens did. This was the New Perspectives on Joseph Smith in Translation. I think this is the conference where Richard Bushman called the Book of Abraham pseudepigrapha. But Givens is there, and he says, this is what he says. He said, Terryl Givens was a featured speaker at the New Perspectives conference, and I found his association of bricolage with the translation process to be intriguing. Bricolage is a French term that describes the construction of ideas by using whatever is at hand. Merriam-Webster is the definition where that comes from. In the past, Givens has regarding Joseph Smith being an inspired eclecticist. So there's maybe the phrase that Givens uses, and a sponge. An eclectic will select what appears to be best in various doctrines, methods, or styles, or will compose from elements drawn from various sources. And then the book you mentioned at the very beginning, The Pearl of Greatest Price, written by Brian Haglid and Terryl Givens, Brian Hales writes an article in The Interpreter reviewing their work. And Givens says Smith's transposition of the Egyptian papyri in the Book of Abraham may model a produced type of text, both the notion of bricolage and Eliot's textual transformation seem in keeping with David Bokovoy's hypothesis of the Book of Abraham as inspired pseudepigrapha, where one need not believe that the Book of Abraham is a supernatural, though traditional translation of an ancient text written by a patriarch Abraham, nor the translation of a Hellenized pseudepigraphic Book of Abraham originally written in the 1st century BC. Instead, Bokovoy explains it can make even more sense that by engaging the ancient papyri, the prophet Joseph was inspired to produce this book of scripture as author, or in his vernacular, seer translator. See how we shift the words? This is word shifting here. This is
what they're all saying is the same thing. Joseph Smith got it wrong. Joseph Smith said this is what he's doing, and he was wrong.
Yeah.
Joseph Smith said he was translating from the papyri. He was wrong. We know that. We have the papyri. We have the vignettes. He was not only wrong, he was grossly, horribly wrong. So what do you do with that? What you do with that is say, it doesn't make any difference because he wasn't translating from the papyrus like he said he was. You know, he used to be a translator too. Remember, he was prophet, seer, revelator, and translator with a capital T. It rhymes with P. You know what that stands for. So here we've got Joseph Smith saying all this stuff. I can translate. And you got people like Terryl Givens coming along and saying, no, he couldn't. And he was wrong when he said he could. It's just he wasn't lying, okay? Because he didn't know he couldn't. God was fooling Joseph Smith into thinking he was doing something he wasn't. That's why Joseph Smith was saying he was translating when he wasn't. And Joseph Smith just didn't know. So it can still be revelation anyway. No need to worry, folks.
And then Brian Hales, in the review of the book in that section, he says Givens is proposing in this section that the Egyptian papyri and their vignettes may have inspired Joseph Smith to produce a modern work that he falsely attributes to Abraham. That's the meaning of the term pseudepigrapha. Pseudepigrapha is claiming that Moses wrote something, claiming that Abraham wrote something, claiming that Nephi wrote something, when you're really the one writing it and you're the one creating the story from thoughts inside your own head. There was no ancient author, or if there was an ancient author, he sure as hell didn't say these things you're claiming he said them, and you're putting them into his mouth.
By the way, notice that what Givens is saying is exactly 100% true, as filtered through Brian Hales. Givens is proposing that the Egyptian papyri and their vignettes may have inspired Joseph Smith to produce a modern work that he falsely attributes to Abraham. Absolutely true.
Yep. He did not render into English an ancient story written by Abraham. Consequently, the meaning and purpose of the papyri in their original setting is not important, for this is a modern bricolage inspired by fragments that merely suggest antiquity, but were wholly repurposed for a contemporary creation.
Oh my goodness. This is the old lawyer joke for the defense attorney in closing argument to actually argue. Other than DNA, five eyewitnesses and a signed confession by my client, what do they have?
Yeah. Okay.
Imagine how overwhelming and irrefutable the evidence must be for the apologists to concede on all of these issues.
Yeah, by the way, that's just it. On every issue on the truth claim, the apologists have had to cave in to the critic and go, all right, we can't argue with the critic anymore. We have to create a response that acknowledges everything the critic sees so that it is indistinguishable or indiscernible from a fraud. So we'll come up with the catalyst theory.
Right.
We'll come up with what is Blake Ostler's expansion theory.
Yes.
We got to have tapers represent horses. We got to, whatever. You just keep coming up with arguments that allow the data to be in favor of the critic, but which, if you allow a little conjecture, give a little allowances, create some mental gymnastics, you can almost get there from here.
Right. It used to be when I joined the church that Mormonism presented itself as something, and I presented it as an apologist, as something that could be proven and demonstrated. Now, that was when Mormonism apparently felt evidence was on its side. Here we are 45 years later, 47 technically, and the church is now scared of all the evidence. All the evidence is so far against the church that now it has to come to a point where it reconstructs its own foundational stories in order to make them so they can't be proven wrong, so that they're unfalsifiable. That's what the whole point of having a catalyst theory is. It's unfalsifiable. Why is it unfalsifiable? Because it looks just like a freaking fraud. That's why the expansion theory has been brought into service and created, because it's unfalsifiable. Why is it unfalsifiable? Because it looks just like a freaking fraud.
Shifting the Joseph Smith translation from a restoring of a corrupt text to its perfect form to a flawed commentary makes it indistinguishable from a fraud.
Because that's what it is. Even if Joseph Smith, take God completely out of this whole equation, it's a flawed commentary. And that's the beauty of it. If you can come up with an explanation that doesn't require God in it at all, then it's like you've hit the sweet spot if you're a Mormon apologist. Does Terryl Givens have anything else to tell us here?
Fraser, which was popular in Joseph Smith's day. We know that Joseph Smith had a book in his collection written by the great German Lutheran John Mosheim, and this is probably the most influential book in Protestant history in terms of espousing a certain understanding of corruption and apostasy that came to be called the Great Apostasy of the Catholic Church. And this clearly seems to have had an influence on Joseph Smith and subsequent writers from B.H. Roberts to James Talmage.
Clearly has an influence on Joseph Smith.
Right.
He got his perspective of the Great Apostasy from this book. This is God's truth hiding in the wilderness right here.
Right. It's in the stacks. That's where the wilderness is. And the lady is books. So they're hiding in the library stacks.
They borrowed largely this Protestant narrative of the falling away from the original church.
Joseph Smith borrowed the narrative of the falling away and the restoration.
Sources here that Joseph used in his own personal studies. We know that he had a copy of Buck's Theological Dictionary.
Yes,
and it seems to be the case that Joseph would frequently resort to definitions that came from this theological dictionary, which was a really popular reference book in Joseph Smith's
resort,
day.
he means claim it came from
also
God.
had a copy of Clark's commentary, a 6-volume commentary on the Bible, which little bits and snippets of it appear every now and then in Joseph Smith's own commentaries and writings. So it seems.
See, he's playing a game right there. He said it appears in Joseph Smith's own commentaries because he's not telling the audience, but what he means is I'm talking about the Joseph Smith translation.
You're right. He is covering up a little bit. Even here, where he's basically giving away the game, he's still trying to go home with a couple of coins in his pocket.
Yes. Rather than say it was found in the Joseph Smith translation, he leads the audience to think somewhere Joseph wrote a commentary.
Yeah, Joseph Smith never wrote a commentary. He was Mr. Revelation.
He had the inspired translation of the Bible. There are no Joseph Smith commentaries. The game has changed. By the way, folks, listen. Not only did Thomas Wayment say that it's a flawed commentary, the Saints Unscripted, which is the youth extension of the church in content creation, whether officially or unofficial, they've said it. And then just recently, Brad Wilcox has said it. And
well,
here
it must be true.
Yeah, and now you have Terryl Givens saying it. This is the new framing for the Joseph Smith translation.
Right.
It is now a Joseph Smith commentary that is flawed and really isn't that important, except that the Book of Moses is still canonized and they can't quite untie it from the Joseph Smith translation because it is.
And that was a beautiful point you made. First off, they're all going, damn, I can't believe back in 1980, 81, or 79, we put all that damn Joseph Smith translation into our freaking Bible. Now it's going to be embarrassing to take it out again. And like you noted, and that's very important, they can say that the Joseph Smith translation is a flawed commentary all they want. But the problem that you pointed out is that they've got it as part of their canonized scripture in the Book of Moses, in the Pearl of Great Price. That is the Joseph Smith translation. So how is it a flawed commentary ends up being canonized as Holy Scripture in the LDS Church? Very good question you raised, Mr. Reel.
Clear that he also thought that there was a great deal of inspiration behind that commentary.
Because he borrowed from it
He's
so
a
much.
scholar at Yale University. who has done extensive work trying to identify the influence of John Milton in Joseph Smith's work. And there's just a lot of ideas that show up in Paradise Lost that will appear again in Restoration teachings.
Wow.
And this was one of the most popular books in 19th century America.
What does it have in
It's
it?
a collection of works by William Ellery Channing.
Hmm.
Can't prove that this was in Joseph Smith's library, but there's a chapter here called Remarks on the Character and Writings of John Milton. And it seems more than likely that Joseph would have been familiar with John Milton, probably through this source.
Hang on a second, Bill. So that's an example of what you'd said before, which is where Terryl Givens, this is not a book that he knows that Joseph Smith had in his library, but it is so clear to him the connections between the contents of this book and its availability to Joseph Smith that he is positing that it must have been in his library or Joseph Smith had access to it because there's so much influence from John Milton in Joseph Smith's teachings.
Yeah. And I just want to note the phone number is up on the screen, 662-667-6667. Folks, you're welcome to call into the show. We'd love to hear from you on what you think of tonight's episode. The phone lines are open. I will also, if you want to come in studio, you're welcome to do that as well. I'll put that into all the destinations. So that should show up in the live chat of wherever you're watching this. And then I just want to note, RFM, I have Paradise Lost on my shelf. I was looking for it. I don't see it, but it's over there. I bought it because it's one of the great pieces of literature throughout world history. And so if you walk into a Barnes and Noble or a bookstore and you go to where like the classics are, Paradise Lost will be there. And I have it on my shelf. I've never, until this whole thing, I didn't know the connection. And now I haven't read it yet. And so now I'm going to go read it and see where I can find some Mormonism inside.
Well, I'll tell you, most of it has to do with Satan, I expect, in the heavenly councils and the war in heaven and his falling. So if you'll hang on a second, because I actually have read it because it's one of those important works. It's very long. It's not easy reading, I'll tell you that. It's where the famous phrase from Satan comes. He always gets the best lines, by the way. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. That's from Satan. So anyway, and I think that has a lot to do with the relationship between Joseph Smith's premortal council in heaven and the conflict there between God and his forces and Satan and his forces.
Yeah. Okay. Do you think there's more here still yet to go into?
Well, let's see. We know when he stands up, we're going to cut it because then he's going to go off and get a copy of the Bible. It's not the same Bible that Joseph Smith used for his Joseph Smith translation. It's a Cooper's edition, but he has one that's from a few years later. He's very proud of it. It doesn't really advance what he's saying here, so we'll cut there. Okay. It might be right now. I don't know.
And there's something in the neighborhood of about 50 books that Joseph Smith donated, and I've managed to assemble about half that number. And I'm going to take you now to show you.
I assume that's where he's leaving.
Yep. Very good. So there you have it from the horse's mouth. Terryl Givens, top apologist, explaining in meticulous detail with academic and scholarly research how it is that Joseph Smith created Mormonism.
Yeah. Before you close out, or before we go to phone lines, I just want to say one thing here. So one is, folks, if you want to join the newsletter of the nonprofit, we send out a newsletter every 2 to 3 months or so. It's how we sort of stay in contact with donors. It's how we stay in contact with fans and followers. If you want to join the newsletter, please do that. That's up on the page, up on the screen now, and I'll put the link down below here in just a moment. Phone lines are open, and there are people waiting to talk to us. So there are 2 folks there. I just want to say, RFM, the amount of time in your life that you've spent thinking about these kinds of things to be able to clearly articulate all of these ideas that you did several years ago in a Radio Free Mormon episode, did it again tonight, taking things that RFM or that Terryl Givens and Brian covered in the Pearl of Greatest Price. I'm deeply appreciative of the skill set you bring to the table to be able to delve into these things. And I think folks are very appreciative. It seems like there was a lot of positive comments that this episode was really well received by folks who were watching and listening. If you want to support Radio Free Mormon in him spending his time and energy to put content like this together, tonight's episode was 98% RFM. Would you please go to either radiofreemormon.org or MormonismLive.org. Click the donate button and sign up to send $5 a month, $10 a month, $20 a month, whatever you can. Here we are in the front end of 2025. We've been doing this for years, RFM. I think this was another incredible episode, and our hope is to continue to do this far into the future, having conversations like this. So if things like this are helpful to you, will you please go to radiofreemormon.org, click the donate button, go to mormonismlive.org, click the donate button, and sign up for a recurring donation, something small, $5 a month, $10 a month. But it is what supports RFM, myself, other content creators in being able to put their time and energy into creating content like this. RFM, you spent lots of hours putting this together, and I just want to say thank you. And it really is an act of love and service to this community.
Well, thank you. I'm excited about the subject matter and what we've covered tonight. I think this is an important episode in talking about the fundamental question of how did Joseph Smith create Mormonism? And I think Terryl Givens is onto something.
Yeah, he's no dodo, is he?
No, he has read a couple of books.
He has. He's gone to a pretty good school.
Yeah, he's a professor at a pretty good school.
That's right.
Okay, so first call, I believe, is Isaac. I'm hoping this works. If not, if everyone will be patient, I promise. There it is. Isaac, are you there?
Yeah, am I on?
Yeah, you're on Mormonism Live with Radio Free Mormon and myself. Your thoughts on tonight's episode and the impact that things like this have had on you?
Oh yeah, for sure. First of all, I want to say I'm a huge fan of you guys. I've spent the last on the live chat. I'm Worldview Connections, and you know, I appreciate you guys. I've been watching for over a year or so and listening just to get caught up with what you guys have said, and I appreciate everything you guys do. But yeah, I was serving as a bishop when I got an edition of the 1830 edition of the Book of Mormon, and I mean, obviously, right then and there, I saw that Joseph Smith's whole, you know, saying the Book of Mormon is the most correct of any book on this earth. I knew it was false, you know. And
you know, Isaac, as a good friend of mine, used to always correct me. Isaac, I'm sorry. As a good friend of mine, always used to correct me. I think he's probably right, but I haven't verified it. Whenever I would use that quote from Joseph Smith, he'd always stop me and say, "No, wait a second. What Joseph Smith said was not that the Book of Mormon is the most correct book. That got changed. What Joseph Smith actually said was the Book of Mormon is the correctest book," which sounds a lot more like the Book of Mormon, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And you guys have referred to a lot of things that Terryl Givens went through. It's like the changes from the Book of Commandments to the Doctrine and Covenants, where the revelations literally went 180. You know, and I've, you know, listened to you guys' show. You guys have gone through this. But what's crazy is now we have Mormon apologists acknowledging this. Like, isn't that wonderful, folks? You know, it's like, no, it's not wonderful. This is not what I mean, I've left the church now, but for years I gave my life to the church.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I served in every calling of the ward, gave my whole soul to the church.
Yeah.
And then when the essays started coming out, you know, and the church was like trying to make it sound good, but it's like, no, man, the DNA of the Book of Mormon, the translation process, the first vision accounts, the priesthood mess, all the racism. I was like, I'm done. I'm out. You know? And like the Mormon apologists now, they're what I, on my mission in Chicago in 1997 to 1999, they're talking like what the anti-Mormons were talking like. You know?
How do you mean? You mean the things they were talking about the church and its history?
Yeah, that I was explicitly told these things are not true. You know, Joseph Smith didn't live polygamy, and what they're saying, they're passing out pamphlets. Those aren't true, elders. And my mission president called it spiritual pornography. Lies.
That's where the Holy Ghost is only,
you know, right? And once right? And then, like, I remember coming out while I was a bishop, my stake president's kind of trying to, you know, sweep it under the rug. And that's why I relate so much to you, Bill Real, is like, you're serving as a bishop and you're like, wait, what's happening? What is this? What? No, this is not what I gave my life for. And they're pretending like, whoa, what are you, crazy? The gaslighting comes in, right? It's like, what you should have known that. No. You guys told me that was not true.
Right.
You know?
Absolutely.
No, I appreciate your show because it's right on the nail.
Thank you. There's 100 reasons to not be a member of the LDS Church. And there's only one reason to be a member of the LDS Church. The one reason to be a member is that it's true. And when you find out that it's not true, then the 100 other reasons start forcing you to a different conclusion.
Exactly. I mean, I even like, I went so deep down the rabbit hole that I was like, okay, I'm going to re-look through the Book of Mormon. I'm going to reread through it again. Those jokers that came on Mormon Stories and tried to, shame John DeLynn. Like, you don't read the Book of Mormon anymore because you lost spirit. Like, no, dude, I lost the spirit the more I read the Book of Mormon and the more I researched it in the Bible. The errors are in there, just like what you guys are going through. And now the Mormon apologists are like gaslighting us. Like, isn't that wonderful though? No, it's not. These are flaws of the Bible in there. You know what I mean? And so I was like literally rewriting the Book of Mormon in modern English. I literally did it to the whole Book of Mormon. And not only did I see the flaws and the problems, but I also saw how racist it is. And like people are like, oh, but I keep holding on to the church because the Book of Mormon is so amazing. Like, really? It's racist garbage, man.
There's nothing that we know about Jesus in the Book of Mormon that cannot be learned from the New Testament.
Right.
The surprising thing is that the Book of Mormon writers know all about the New Testament and what Jesus was going to do and his mother's name and the guy who's going to baptize him and where he's going to be baptized and all these different things about Jesus hundreds of years before he was born.
What caught me off guard, Isaac, and it's something you said earlier that sort of struck something I've said in the past, which is even if this church isn't true, you would sort of expect that at least some of the things it claims in its history connected to truth claims would hold up. Even if it was a false church, it would sort of get a coincidence kind of bullseye once in a while. And what I discovered was the truth claims of the church, they hinge on historical events, and every single one of those is problematic and in favor of the critic. Book of Abraham, Book of Moses, Joseph Smith translation. And then as you pointed out, everything's changing. I mean, you don't get a planet anymore. Free agency isn't an eternal principle of the gospel. We have an ongoing restoration and there's more in front of us than behind us. When President Hinckley said most of it's behind us and there'll be very little in front of us. Everything about Mormonism is shifting and changing. And it's such a weird thing to watch believers sort of take these constant hits of change and it just doesn't faze them. Like they're going to believe, damn it, no matter what. It doesn't matter what comes out. It doesn't matter what facts there are. It doesn't matter what evidence gets presented. Mormonism just has to be true regardless. And a thing that really helped me, and I'm saying this so that maybe somebody who believes, who's watching and is at least poked a little bit and goes, yeah, maybe there's something to what these guys say. Start thinking about Mormonism like an outsider. And what I mean by that is start looking at other faiths and start asking yourself, why in religions that you agree are untrue, why do people know those untruths, the evidence? Why are there people in those religions who also know the evidence of their religion and they continue to believe? Why are there believers in every religion and some of those believers know the problems and they continue to believe? And if it's because somehow they're participating in some sort of self-deception, then what's the possibility that you're committing some sort of self-deception and nothing about this church adds up and you're believing in spite of it? Anyway, I appreciate the phone call.
100% agree. No, and it's just like you said, Bill, I never wanted a faith crisis. I wanted this to be true. I gave my whole soul to it. She's now my ex-wife. She divorced me because I came to the truth and she wouldn't accept that. I tried to make it work so long until it just almost broke me.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, you wanted
going to church to make my ex-wife happy, you know?
Oh, no, I hear exactly what you're saying.
It to break everything up.
No.
Absolutely. When you get to that point, you either go one way or the other. You either break and say, I can't do this anymore, or you become church broke and you'll do anything you're told to do by the church.
Yeah.
Right. And I don't know what's keeping people in now. Like you said, Bill, it's like, what is this new Mormon mush? It's like watered down mush. You're going to give your life to this? I wouldn't have. No way. Had I known all the historical stuff I know now, when I was 18, I'd be like, no way. Why would I go on a mission? You know, what's that for? No way.
Yeah.
No, it's quite a corner the church has
But
backed
anyway,
itself
thank
into.
you guys.
Yeah,
Thank you, Isaac. Thanks for calling. Appreciate it.
The the apologists and the defenders of the faith and the believers in the chat, watching this, they see you and me as like antichrist, and we're deceiving, we're deceptive, we're not trustworthy. But man, something he said and something they're saying in the live chat, like when I delved into reading and learning about Mormonism as I was a 17-year-old convert, even before my conversion, I was reading No Man Knows My History by Fawn Brody. I wanted to know the good and the bad. I wanted to know if this church really could stand on its own two legs. And the last thing I wanted nothing to this day, even to this day, there's a part of my brain that goes, I want nothing more than Mormonism to be true.
Mhm.
Um,
And I will tell you out there, I stopped going to church probably about 2014. I think it's been 10 years now. 90% of what I know about the LDS Church now, I knew then. I learned over that course of time
yeah.
because I spent inordinate amounts of time, ridiculous amounts of time studying the LDS Church and its history and its doctrine and publishing on it. No, I did not want this to be false. I did everything I could to make it true until finally I became exhausted trying to make excuses for the inexcusable.
Yep. Okay. Next call. Simona has a question for us. Simona, are you there?
Yes.
What's your
Boy,
question?
guys, my question was really by listening to what Givens is trying to explain, then Joseph Smith was able to, not to use the word translate, but to give us that version of the Bible, Moses and those chapters, is that it just doesn't make sense. It feels to me that his argument is actually even make it more clear than Joseph Smith was faking all this time, that he claimed that God was revealing all these truths about the Bible, and that's why he had to write it, translate the Bible, because the one that they had at the time was not accurate. But I also, I don't know, I wanted to ask you, what do you think the church is trying to do by releasing even this video about Givens? Because I don't think it's going to help much the church with it. And then just wanted to say that also, I identify with what Isaac and Bill and other friends have just said, because I joined the church in 1980. And like I say, I've been an active member. So I was a Sunday school teacher. And so to see all those changes, I mean, to me, it got at the point where, yes, I couldn't keep making excuses, because my first 3 children, they left the church, and I felt so bad. And I was trying to bring them back to the church, but they always will bring me arguments why I was wrong, and it was the wrong, and it was that Mormonism was wrong. And finally, I decided to start researching myself, and I realized that, they were correct. And I'm grateful actually for them that they opened my eyes to try to find the truth. Now, with regards to what you say, why it seems that there's still members there, then it doesn't matter how many truths are revealed about why Mormonism is fake. Is that they still are there. They will want to believe whatever they are told. It doesn't matter, even if it doesn't make sense. And I talk to people, I still in touch with some members of my ward, and they, I go out with them, and they, when I try to bring up anything, it's like they just don't want to hear it. So even my kids, we have a discussion about why that's the case. And it's because my kids concluded it's because these members of the church are so invested in the church. All their life they have believed on all those lies. Then for them to admit that they were wrong, it will be horrible. It will be so bad for them. But I think maybe the ones that we decide to walk away from all these lies are very brave. I really see it now that we are very brave, and we are able to understand and see, no, we were in the wrong path, and and we just move on with our lives.
We did the thing we desperately did not want to do, and we did it because it was the right thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%.
So just my question answered. What do you think is going to happen with Givens, giving this we can say different perspective how Joseph Smith came about
Right
his
now, the
revelations
church.
of the Bible?
Oh, and Simona, in answer to your question, which I think is a good one, in answer to your question, what the church is doing right now is they're allowing anybody to shoot their mouth off as long as they will defend the priesthood primacy and superiority and authority of the apostles and prophets. It doesn't make any difference what direction they're coming from. They're not about finding a position and sticking to it. They're about trying to appeal to the biggest number of people, even if it's in different ways, even if it's in contradictory ways, if it will get them to stay in the church or come back. I think that's what's going on.
Yeah, I want to ask you something. She said something at the beginning of her phone call that I want to sort of ask you, and then I just want to note sort of one of the things she asked was, why do people still believe? And it's not just a Mormon problem. First off, it's a human thing. When we are invested in a belief, if someone says your wife's cheating on you, it takes an insurmountable amount of evidence before you go like, oh, I guess she's cheating on me. We don't want to shift in beliefs that will be deeply detrimental to our identity, to our well-being, to our safety and security. We are evolutionarily programmed. Now, specifically, if you step out of Mormonism and you look at the Jehovah's Witnesses, there's a prime example. Their leadership prophesied. Do you know who the founder was of the Jehovah's Witnesses?
Charles Taze Russell, Allegheny, Pennsylvania.
Yeah. So Charles Russell said that Jesus would come back in, I think, 1890.
Yeah, he had a lot of predictions.
And then 1914 again or something like that.
Mhm.
Neither time does he come back. And the Jehovah's Witnesses, rather than go, well, that didn't hold up, we're out of here. There's been research done. They actually believed stronger
Mhm.
at that moment. So there is something inside of believers that when the evidence just mounts up, unless it crosses a certain threshold for them, and it took a decade for me, 15 years for me, for it to cross that threshold where I was like, oh, what if it's not true? It happens in all religions. High demand fundamentalist religions prey on that, and they create ways that things such as thought stopping techniques. I heard someone mention thought stopping cliches in the chat, thought stopping techniques that are meant to get you away from your question and move you back into belief. That's the first thing. But the thing I wanted to ask you, RFM, is Terryl Givens if you really look at the words he uses, he's not pulling punches and saying God led Joseph Smith to grabbing that idea. The words he's using indicates that Terryl believes Joseph's just used his imagination, put some ideas together, and created sort of parts of this religion without a lot of confidence on his part, based on his language, that God is the author of that process that we talked about tonight.
Okay, well, there's two. Great question. Makes me think of this. There's two ways of talking about apostles and what they say and whether it's from God, right? Or anybody else. The first is that they have to fast and pray and get themselves all right to receive the revelation from God. That's what a lot of us think. The fact is that when you get up in the ranks, you start getting this other idea imposed on you, and this is documented, that because of your position in the church, whatever you say is from God. See, it's about your position. Not whether it's really from God, it's about the position that you hold. And I think that what Terryl Givens is doing with Joseph Smith is basically saying, it's clear, and I'm documenting all these different important ideas to Mormonism that Joseph Smith is getting from all these different sources in his community, right? And his environment. I think that when push comes to shove, what Terryl Givens would have to say is, the ideas that Joseph Smith ended up borrowing or cribbing from other people were from God, because Joseph Smith cribbed those ideas. In other words, it was inspiration because Joseph Smith was the one making the decisions, regardless of whether God was actually telling him to pick this, that, and the other thing.
Those ideas are true because Joseph Smith is a prophet, not Joseph Smith's a prophet because those ideas are true.
I kind of think that's probably it.
Wow, that's okay. And I'll just say, because the chat was a little lively tonight with folks who were bearing their testimony and arguing without really presenting any sort of answer to what we're saying, I just put a thing up on the screen. It's also in the live chat. This is a list of resources for those who are maybe just on the cusp of wanting to start investigating church truth claims. This is the dishonesty of the church documented, the list of inconsistencies in the theology that are documented, the listing of fallibility and leader abandonment and reversals of past teachings that are documented, and then the deep historical dives into Mormon history that URFM and I have done in our time creating content. So there's tons of them with documents put up on the screen and us walking you through the history in a way that no apologist that I know of is doing. And I would just encourage anybody who's on the believing side, who's wanting to starting to ask questions and wants to start investigating whether Mormonism is really true or not, check out that link. Take your time. If you have any questions, you're welcome to email us at MormonDiscussionsPodcasts with an S on the end, both the discussions and the podcast with an S on the end at gmail.com, or RadioFreeMormon1 at gmail.com. And feel free to reach out to us. And we're happy to answer questions, and we won't blame you for the mess. The mess was created by them.
Bill, you're much nicer than I am. Bill will answer your questions. I will ignore your emails because I'm going to be busy preparing for other podcasts.
I will answer your questions. So send them to the Mormon Discussions with an S on the end, podcast with an S on the end at gmail.com.
If you want to really find out about the LDS Church and the issues, go to Fair Mormon and read their responses to whatever questions you have. That'll drive you out of the church faster than anything Bill or I could say.
It did for us. Okay. Last call of the night. This might be Ishmael. Ishmael, is that the name?
Yeah, it's a
pseudonymous
it's
name.
a pseudonym.
Yeah.
I'm just
Ishmael.
It's a Moby Dick reference. So
Call me Ishmael, baby.
Yeah, I'm just wanted to comment real quick and hopefully I'm as articulate as I can be. This is the first time I've called one of these any show like this before. So whenever Professor Givens kind of talks and uses these words such as, bricolage and
Eruption,
all this sort of stuff, talking about, as to me, as somebody who has made things, who has written creative fiction, who has written and recorded their own music, who has tried to do creative things for years and years. Whenever this is described to me, it sounds just like somebody who is doing a work of art, sort of, who's making a work of art, not a super fantastic work of art, not like a genius level work of art, but a work of art. That's what
a workman-like work of art.
Sounds a workman-like work of art with huge passages just copied out of another work of art. But that's what it feels like to me. And I actually feel I just kind of wanted to say something. I wanted to make that explicit. I feel sometimes we sort of not necessarily dance around it, but I've heard people say before, 100 years later, Joseph Smith would have been like a sci-fi writer. And I actually feel that there's real similarities between him and L. Ron Hubbard, not just for the fact that they made their own religions, but L. Ron Hubbard was a pulp writer before he did that stuff. So
can I just note something? I was talking to RFM before tonight's show. And the one thing you can say about L. Ron Hubbard as a sci-fi writer is that his theology, I went looking tonight before the show started. I wanted to find if anybody was out there within the sort of the post-Scientology realm pointing out that L. Ron Hubbard was cribbing sources in the same way that Joseph Smith was, and I don't find that. It appears that L. Ron Hubbard did do something better than Joseph Smith, which is create Scientology's theology, the thetans and the volcanoes and the aliens flying around and certain presences taking over bodies. he seems to have sort of invented that in his head. And again, he was an expert at it because he was writing sci-fi stories his whole life. So at least on some level, maybe that's a difference between Joseph Smith being an eclectic aggregator or being a bricoleur, or L. Ron Hubbard just carrying over his sci-fi work as an author into a religion.
Right. And there are those who maintain.
Yeah,
Oh, excuse me. I'm sorry. I was just going to say that there are those who maintain, and I tend to agree with them, that today's extraterrestrials are merely the incarnation of earlier angels. In other words, it used to be angels. Now it's aliens. It's the concept hasn't changed, but we have. And so we tweak it a bit to keep up with us.
Yeah. Both are messengers from some other
Yeah,
place.
that makes sense. And I mean, I would defer, Bill, to your knowledge about. I haven't done a ton of research into Scientology, but so I would defer to you on that. And I would just kind of, and add that maybe another word I would use for what, especially something like the Book of Mormon, where it is so much quoting, and so much outright insertions from other texts. You could almost call it a collage in a way.
It's a collage. It's a mural. It's a pastiche.
It's a brick.
It's a bricolage. Yeah, they're all words that mean the same
Yeah,
thing.
exactly.
Yeah.
It's like a remix, So
it's like your furniture. Eclectic means that you collect furniture from different, they have no relationship with their sources. They don't match. And yet somehow the feng shui works.
Yeah.
And that's what eclectic means.
And
that's what these doctrines that just assembled are.
Different sources, varied sources. Yeah. And if you're really good at it, if you're a genius, everything works in a sort of new and profound way. I honestly don't think Joseph Smith was that. If he was, I would find the Book of Mormon more engaging. That being said.
Well, what if Scripture's not engaging
All right.
to you personally? I'm sorry. I'll stop doing the apologist stick. I did it for decades. It's ingrained. I apologize. Never mind. Thank you for calling very much, Ishmael.
All right. Thank you. Have a great night.
You too.
Thank you. Good night to you too.
All right. I'm turning off the show. You'll hear a beep, everybody. That's the end of the call-in studio.
I'm starting to think I'm just an argumentative.
Yeah. Sorry about that. So that's all I've got. You can take us home, RFM. Great show tonight.
Thank you. I've got an expectation that I'll go home. I'll wake up tomorrow morning, no voice, and hopefully we'll come back by Friday night for Mormonism After Dark, which is at 8:00 p.m. on Friday night. We're going to have a lot to talk about. That is much more viewer-driven throughout, where you can show up by phone, or you can come on by StreamYard and have your bright, beautiful face show up like ours in your own box. All right. So that's about it. Do you have anything else you'd like to add, Bill?
Nope. See
All right.
everybody.
And thank everybody with the last bit of my voice, with my last gasp. I spit at thee. Anyway, we're talking about Moby Dick. Thanks so much for joining us. I just got to make it across the finish line. I'm almost there. Don't fall down. Everybody, thanks so much for joining us. It's been a wonderful, wonderful evening. It's been over 3 hours now. Bill, really, you're a saint. Everybody else out there, you're wonderful. And please join us next week on Wednesday at 6:20 p.m. for another episode of Mormonism Live.
Mormonism Live. Better than